we should. Yeah. Great.
I share my screen. I think we started, we ended last time at the top of section 5 of book 2. So like previous times, I'm going to read my notes and then stop me whenever you guys wanna intervene, by all means.
We could perhaps just summarize very quickly what we saw last time, right? Because it's very dense reading.
Yes, I agree.
I think that the whole part on the in existence of the whole is a bit. I mean, at first it's a bit more simple in the sense that it's very straightforward, the way of extracting consequences from the paradox of the set of all sets of the multiple of all multiples. But though he's aiming at a very specific one, right? He's aiming at saying we have a sort of weird ontological proof that there must be multiple domains. Let's put it like this, right? Let's not call it sets, but class, right? The sort of if the whole is contradictory in this sense, from the standpoint of the other commitments we have, we need to have a commitment to the multiplicity of worlds or the multiplicity of these domains. We don't have the good name for it yet. He hasn't defined it. Then he claims that, well, this is connected, not only a finite, I mean, multiplicity, but an infinite multiplicity of domains. And then he separates this claim from, let's say, a physical claim from a like Poiret's claim about the infinite universe.
Yeah, the cosmological
claim. Yes, this is not a cosmological claim. He even says physics today has retracted in many ways with regards to this question, and claim, and some currents in physics claim that the universe is finite and things like this. But he tries to show that what he's talking about, this infinity of domains, it's merely, let's say, the thinkable consequence of the ontology. It's not the visible cosmological consequence. He's not trying to deduce something about the cosmos out of ontology, which would totally go against his proposal. He's not proposing mathematical ontology as a sort of structure of the universe, right? As far as we know, what we call cosmos can very well be kind of a stitching together of some of these infinite domains. Ontology for Badiou can very well kind of account for another universe. Doesn't really have to do with ours necessarily. So I think that from a summary of that part, this particular aspect is very important. That the multiplicity of domains, and I'm not calling it worlds yet, follows from the impossibility of the multiple of all multiples, but that doesn't mean a cosmological argument. It means something else, right?
Yeah, the way I read it, what I found really interesting in this argument to derive the multiplicity of, so to speak, worlds. He hasn't defined it yet, but to derive the multiplicity of worlds from the inexistence of the whole, because once you establish the inexistence of the whole, it seems that any consistency you must have for some form of appearance must be a localized consistency.
Yeah,
because you don't have the appeal to the global, he defines universe, right? The whole of all sets, but a universe that does not exist. But okay, you can have an appeal to the universe set in order to account for the appearance of singular things. So these appearances must have their consistency constituted within a localized realm, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So this is mainly the form of the argument, right? So yes. You have these local operations. I'm always having trouble translating because I'm reading French. This will be an issue next week. But the minimum degree of transcendental, right? The conjunction and the envelope. is it envelope in English, in the English translation
Yes,
as well?
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, okay. So in the envelope, so this should account for the possibility of some multiple appearing, right? Since you don't have a general concept or a general reference to which you can make a reference to a whole wherein you can localize these appearing things, right? So I think it's a very interesting argument for
Yeah, it is.
the localization of this algebra he's proposing.
And I think one thing that is important in his style of presentation is that he's very, he sticks to his non-abstract, very empirical way of thinking. I mean, although the terms that he explains are appear to be very abstract, but the fundamental problem that he's after is very, very simple and very empirical in some sense. He's basically, as we said, was we can think appearances, from ontology. We know of inconsistent multiplicities. So how can inconsistent multiplicity, which is completely ambivalent to the word of appearing, can appear? And number two is how inconsistent multiplicity or presentation of those multiplicities makes us realize or think or recognize, I should say, recognize consistent appearance. So these are the two questions: the possibility of appearance and the consistency of appearance are the two main questions that he opens up this book with. And then the first move that he does is that, okay, if we had a whole where there was a place that he calls it a guarantee for all appearances, then we had a different argument. So let's examine whether the whole is possible. And he says that the concept of whole is inconsistent. And since it is inconsistent, it does not exist. It cannot be. It doesn't have a being. So the thinking of consistent appearance for him naturally, which requires a world, naturally has to deal with multiplicity of worlds. So very simple argument and very, very empirical in my view.
Yes. Well, the thing that I mean, the way that I understand the passage from parts 1 to 4, very briefly stated, just so we don't get lost in the summary, I would say that exactly as you guys were arguing, from this argument regarding the existence of the whole, we get the idea of local consistency. Well, things can only consist locally. Then part 2, which deals with the one called derivation of the thinking of a multiple on the basis of that of another multiple. He goes from local consistency to relative identity, right? If you cannot have a general global placement, a global consistency, a global coherence, then the coherence is relative. Therefore, you need another multiple with regards to which you measure your identity,
Yes.
right? And then part 3, which moves on top of this as well. We have the idea of locality. We have the idea of relative identity. Well, all of this is, the question is, okay, but what constitutes a place? When we say local, what do we mean, right? Because that's still open. And then he says, well, it's a space of operation. So he kind of binds together what we got from part 1 and from part 2, the idea of locality with the idea of a relative identity and difference. and say, well, the space of an operator, of certain operations, that let's say the closure of a domain under a certain set of operations, that will give us the basic idea of a world. A world will be the local and coherent.
It's important though. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, it's just adding that it is important to have in mind that this space of operation is not like, you know, Newtonian space that predates the operation that happens within it, right? He's pretty clear about this. Is a space of operations or something produced by the operations in a sense, right? The operations produce a consistency, a localized consistency wherein you can locate the objects within that consistency, but it is produced by the operations themselves in a sense, right? So I think we were talking about this analogically about this concept of a Newtonian space versus a Leibnizian space. And I think it was Dennis that was agreeing with me that this is more akin to if we go there, this kind of metaphysics, modern metaphysics, of a Leibnizian space wherein, you know, space is produced by the objects that are there, by the extensions that are embedded within objects. So it's not like, you use another analogy last time with the rule, right? Have a rule over a certain space. So it's not like that. You have the space, then the rule after the space is produced by the rule of, you know, unfolding of these appearances. Just wanted to add this.
This is crucial because the reason this is crucial when it comes together on part 4, because then he defines in part 4, okay, this identity, and I think this is the crucial thing, the equivalence between locality, relative identity, and operational closure. These three things are describing the same thing. To be locally coherent, to be relatively identifiable, and to be closed under certain operations. Those three things will be made equivalent. And that's exactly, that's one of the crucial claims of the book, in fact, that, you know, and the reason why he uses algebraic topology a lot, which is we want a way to describe these structures or whatever you want to call these worlds, where the view from the standpoint of operations is equivalent to the view from the standpoint of differentiation, which is equivalent to the view from the standpoint of placement and topology. Right? Those are three equivalent descriptions. And it's not, I don't think it's for anything that it's exactly after he's stating these three properties, it's kind of indirectly, he's articulating a lot from points 1 to 3. But when we get to point 4, which is the one that introduces the idea of appearing and the idea of the transcendental, he spent a lot of time arguing that, look, this view that I just gave you guys about operational closure that is locally coherent and that defines identities and differences, and we will see an ordering of this within this operational space. This is objective in the sense that it is not subjective, right? And he argues using Meillassoux that to think about the coherence of a world, you don't need to, it's not a necessary presupposition that it is coherent for you, right? The meaning of appearance there, I think it's very subtle, right? Because it's very hard to have an intuitive idea that something appears, but there is no subject of appearance. What could appearance mean if it's not that it appears to some form of synthesis, right? Of subjective synthesis. And I think that that is the first point where we get the sort of counterintuitive thing that Badiou is looking for, right? He will mention, first thing that I really like about this is that he mentions Meillassoux. He's praising the guy, but he's actually saying something really bad about Meillassoux, which is Meillassoux thinks he's doing ontology, but he's just doing phenomenology. Because the archifossil argument from Meillassoux is an ontological argument. It's not like the argument about the autonomy or independence of a world. It's something about being and access to being. So for Badiou, he brings it up in a way that is actually not something I think Meyasu would totally approve. But then, and he explores the meaning of this, let's say, of appearance thought as this sort of localized coherence, right? So appearance, I think it's hard to, I mean, I have a hard time coming up with a kind of catchphrase or a particular way to approach this that satisfies me. Like, okay, appearance here is not appearance to us, it's kind of appearance to the world, right?
Yeah, it's kind of, it's like this appearance that Badiou speaks of is like the condition for the appearance of something for us, but it's not the appearance for us. It's like, in order for something to appear subjectively, it has to appear objectively. It has to be in a world.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is in a world, some subject can apprehend it, but it has to be in a world. So it is the objective phenomenology, seems to me, is something like it's a middle ground between ontology and what we take normally to be phenomenology. Something like it is in a sense more ontological than, you know, subjective phenomenology, but it's not ontology for Badiou. Ontology is still more abstract, like multiple qua multiple, or that is still more abstract. So the examples he uses against or with / against Meyasu is interesting. He talks about the dinosaurs and things like that. So in a sense, you can't really think the dinosaurs with just the multiple qua multiple, right? They are unbounded multiplicities in his ontological sense. Everything is an unbounded multiplicity or inconsistent multiplicity. But you have to think that because it has an appearance, it has a consistency as an appearance. They are bodies. They have, you know, they should have been physical things and everything like that. So they must consist in a world, and this world must consist without there being any subject to see it. But this is a condition of possibility for us, for the Meyasu argument, even for us to grasp something of this world that was there without any, you know, transcendental subject to see it.
Yeah, I think that one way I think it's good. Yeah, Danny, sorry.
No, go on, sorry.
Dennis, you were saying something.
Oh, no, I didn't say anything, but I think someone messaged on the chat. Seems like you're talking about multiplicities.
Martin, do you wanna say what you're talking about? Perhaps it's easier than.
Yeah.
I don't know Badiou very well, so I'm responding to what I see in the text and what you've been talking about. And it seems that I'm having a problem with the connection between the science and mathematics and the philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about all possible worlds and situating objects in the context of all possible worlds without thinking about process, then you're creating a grid, a matrix that seems to reduce from an account of all possible worlds or futures like you would get in something like phase space to objects which are situated in what was mentioned as a Newtonian and Leibnizian calculus.
No, I don't. I think from what I understand of your question, I mean, there's a lot I'm not sure I followed, but I think that the argument is actually a bit more. It's not really trying to do all of that, right? At this, I mean, I agree. It's a bit hermetic without, let's say, the whole introduction to Badiou's approach. But for him, ontology has nothing to do with, let's say, giving the general structure of phenomena of real objects and things like this. I think we've been trying to kind of push forward this reading, which is not very clear in his own work, but that rather than doing what we usually do with regards to ontology, which is to assume that it talks about what is necessary. If something is, then these certain properties also follow because they are necessary. For Badiou, it's a matter of, since we're talking about this, let's say, he's trying to give us a sort of general matrix to see what is thinkable. Now, the connection between what is thinkable and what is actual is actually much more loose than the connection between, what ontology deems necessary and what we actually see in the world. So to claim that it is thinkable to conceive of local domains that are measured by intrinsic orderings rather than by the way that we abstract from them subjectively, you're doing much less than saying, let's say, what is the structure of space in which objects in physical reality work. You're saying much less than that, in a certain sense, which is always a paradox with his philosophy. It's always saying much less than we expect from ontology, but also trying to say that much less about many more situations or worlds, right? So it must be a loose enough concept of world that we can apply to a work of art and say it is a world. So it's very loose, very, very loose. It wants to hold to the concept very, very few properties. So for now, the only properties he has suggested that we assume as consequences of his other commitments are there. Well, if we assume a certain idea of consistency, and we assume that certain parts of mathematics are useful for that sort of exploration, then it is inconsistent to talk about the set of all sets, and consistency must be a regional rather than a global concept. So if we are interested about the consistency of something, rather than looking for this global description for an ontological view of consistency, we should look for localized description of this consistency and logical coherence. So it's much less, I think, from what I understood from your question, than that. It's not really talking about physics. The Newtonian Leibnizian thing is just let's say, as Caron said, a question of the metaphor. It's an analogy to talk about, when we talk about locality here, are we talking about a place on top of which elements will be in a sort of absolute background, or do we need a different concept of localization? And as we will see with the progression of the chapter, he will actually propose an equivalence and say what I'm calling a local consistency and what I'm calling an operational closure, meaning, let's say, operational closure of certain class of numbers under multiplication and addition. Those things that are actually correlated more intimately. So being localized and being differentiated within that localization, they're actually equivalent things. There are no two separate things. So they're more intrinsically related. But the reference to any theory of physical space is actually, just as Caron says, an analogy. So I think it's less than that.
Yeah, I guess all I was responding to was that there seemed to be inconsistency in the application of scientific and mathematical models to this, and I'm trying to find a way to make consistency, to make them consistent with each other. I guess that's what I was noticing.
But what consistent?
but let me withdraw and listen some more. So that was a provisional comment I wanted to make because I'm really interested, as JP knows, of my work, that I really try to pay attention very closely to scientific metaphors as they become applicable to other domains, like philosophy or art. I have a background somewhat in Deleuze in particular, so that was where I'm coming from. So let me retreat and listen for a little bit longer.
Could I jump in before we start the reading further? Just the idea about what is the utility of this. I had some thoughts on that. I think Badiou is kind of responding, as his reference to Meillassoux shows. He's responding to this problem that in philosophy, where every time philosophers try to talk about being, since Kant, I would say, but probably even before that, every time philosophers talk about being, they always attach this point of view of a subject to it. So it's like, yes, this thing is, insofar as it is perceived, it is synthesized by a conscious being, right? And so Meillassoux' whole problem with that is, okay, well, if our discourse about being is limited by this subjective, ghost that has to, we always have to qualify everything we're saying by saying, okay, well, there's this subject that, this only appears to this subject, but we don't know anything about how it is in itself. Well, then that restriction really limits philosophy, right? And there's many solutions to that problem, but I think Badiou's trying to find the minimal solution to it, the most minimal philosophy that you could come up with to talk about things in themselves without reference to a subject. But the interesting thing is, if you remove the subject, you also remove any reference to the thing that in your question, when you say all possible views, there's no such thing as all possible views, or at least that's not because that's just another way to say
all possible subjectivities.
Exactly.
That's absolutely right. That's exactly what I'm getting at. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So now that you've gotten rid of that ghost, you don't need to deal with it. He's trying to, I feel like Badiou's trying to lighten the load of philosophy. Like philosophers don't need to waste time trying to describe all possible views, all possible spaces. It can just talk about, and this is what the term localization means to me. It's like, okay, let's just talk about one particular view. We don't need to say that this view belongs to anyone. This view is the same as the thing itself. How do you combine a view with the thing itself?
Yeah. Do you think this is kind of what Patricia McCormick is getting at when she talks about the a-human?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the a-human, but I do know of object-oriented philosophy, which it sounds like similar, right? It's this idea that instead of subjects, all we have are objects, and they interact with each other in this relational way. And so a cup of water has its own way of interacting with gravity, for example, or with the earth in terms of gravity or in terms of air pressure.
Or my esophagus, for that matter.
Yeah, or your esophagus, right? There are certain things that can touch or manipulate other things, and certain relationships aren't allowed, right, between two things. And this is a very rich area because it frees philosophy up. But I think Badiou has a slightly different take from both of these, in that he still wants to hold on to a notion of the subject, but this is no longer the subject that is synthesizing reality, but it's the subject that is part of reality. The subject is a part of the processes that are going on, rather than the privileged point of view from which these processes are coherent. And so he's trying to shift that role of the subject into the into these truth procedures or whatever the terminology uses.
Particularly with reference to causal relationships.
No. The subject is not doesn't cause anything. The subject is the only relationship he ever uses. The term he uses is participation or incorporation, which is kind of you could say, like, what is that exactly? But it's more like, how does the subject belong to the process?
Yeah,
right.
I think I'm going to go back to the book, but if I could ask permission to participate down the road, I think I need to read some more before I continue any further. Is that all right with the rest of you?
Of course.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
My pleasure, man. Dennis,
I don't want to. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Go on, Martin.
Go on, Martin.
Let me bow out at this point, but I'd like to come back after I dip a little deeper into this. I'm particularly interested in the way that mathematical and scientific models get deployed, and particularly with reference to object-oriented philosophy. So I'm hoping to absorb and possibly contribute it down the road. But I don't want to keep up your interfere any further with your reading. So let me bow out at this point, and thank you for letting me sit in as long as I have. So thanks, folks. Appreciate it.
Pleasure, man.
Thank you, Martin.
One thing that I think we can use this just to track back to the reading, but also connect with the last point we discussed last time, which I find incredibly underdeveloped by Badiou, though it's clearly, let's say, the model, not the model, but the figure that I think most helps to understand how this shift is operated from a subjectively grounded transcendental to this other thing. Is that last time we mentioned that what we're reading here, if we went to Science of Logic, it would actually take place between the chapter on quantum, which is actually where being an event ends, right? It ends with the mathematical infinity and what is that we know about mathematical infinity and about, let's say, the inner dialectics of infinity that it's missing in Science of Logic. Hegel didn't have access to this. And it begins with an argument that is very similar to the argument of being an event concerning the inexistence of the whole, multiplicity of situations, to move towards a new thing, which is, okay, now let's see what are the consequences for this, of this, to, so the plurality of infinite domains, which is something that's missing from Hegel, to the theory of the doctrine of essence and appearance. And the chapter before that, in between quantum and the doctrine of essence, is a theory of measure. It's a discussion of what it means to measure something. And measure is the problem of an inner relation, where something functions, let's say, part of quantity functions as the quality of quantity, something like that, some crazy dialectical point, right? Where it's kind of the birth of structure out of the quantity of being.
Yeah, the quantity is the quality of not having quality.
Yes. So
this is a quality, and this itself is a quality. Yeah.
So the whole thing is that the passage from part 4 to 5, from the argument of the cooperation of Meillassoux, the discussion of how materialist this view is and how objective it is, to part 5 that we're reading now, it's actually, let's say, kind of operated on top of the fact that the measure of differences is immanent to the world. That's what will give it the closure, right? Let's say if you could only evaluate the operational closure from the outside, you would have to ask the question, but what does a world relate to? not only the multiples of a world relate to each other in a world, that's its operational space, but what does the world relate to, right? But you don't need to ask that question because that question is answered from the inside. And this is what the transcendental will be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is actually, let's say, a twist that connects the whole problematic to the problem of measurement. The archifossil argument its minimal version is an argument about the capacity to, let's say, measure a situation on its terms, right? Rather than measure it on the subject's terms. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, the idea that there's the objectivity can be captured by measurement rather than by the subject needing to guarantee that something appears. We just need to say it can be measured, but
yes,
that measurement can be itself an objective part of the world.
Exactly.
And not something that the subject is responsible for.
Exactly. And I think that this is, let's say, this is the underlying reason why Badiou's logics of worlds is a logic not of experience, but of experimentation, right? We're talking about what is the immanent measurement criteria for the coherence of a given world. It's never a question of how I experience it, because, well, you are compatible with the measure of certain worlds. So you, for example, your eyes perceive certain frequencies. So you will perceive the world in such and such a way, conditioned by those objective orderings, right? But you don't perceive other stuff because you're not in the measure. You're not commensurable with those measures. So one thing that I think this really helps out is that I find part 4 slightly obscure on the way that it starts to introduce the idea of order, right? He says, I think on part 3, that, well, beings differ from itself, they differ from others, that gives it a coherence, and from the idea of difference and coherence and degrees of coherence, degrees of difference, you already start getting this idea of ordering in a certain sense. But we have a tradition of the emergence of an ordering out of the, let's say, lack of quality, right? Which is exactly that part of science of logic between quantum and measure, right? Which is what introduces for Hegel the discussion of essence and appearance, right? The first place we have where being relates to itself in some sense and divides itself into a fixed and an accidental part will be the appearance, let's say, the distinction of a multiple into that which measures and that which is measured, right? So I think it's always a useful kind of background metaphor to have. It kind of justifies why Badiou wants to discuss with Hegel, and it also explains why he's doing a bit of a, as Reza mentioned, kind of a not as generous a reading as he could of Hegel, because there is much more in Hegel of what he's saying than he's giving credit, even though definitely not enough. I think it's a good thing to have in the background, you know, when we read this section.
Yes, I agree. I think the reference to the quantum and to measure clarifies a lot of what he means about what he means by world and what he means by degree as well. I agree with you. The passage wherein he tries to demonstrate that the transcendental is a matter of degrees is way too fast. It's like, no, it's obvious that it's a matter of degrees, so go on. So, I mean, there's something lacking in that part for me as well. I was just like, okay, I can go with it, but it seems to be missing something, and I think the reference to science of logic helps a lot. But
yeah, for once in life, the reference to science of logic helps someone.
I think
that's a statement I've never heard.
No, man. Just go to Hegel. You'll see. Everything
will be clear.
Let's go on.
I just wanted to say, don't you think that the idea of measure for Badiou is a consequence of localization of appearance? Because once you have localization of appearance, it comes to the discussion of whether this appearance is the appearance of how close is this appearance in a world is to another appearance of the same being in another world, and how different they are. Once you have multiple appearances of the same in itself, so to speak, the self pure being, the same pure being, then it comes to the question of how different or how close these appearances are. So the philosophical question of this closeness is what, the way that I read it, gives rise to the question of measure. Mm-hmm. So to me, the localization is the ground for popping up the question of measure.
But it seems like you can't really talk about localization without measure, if insofar as the transcendental is basically any possible measure, right?
Yeah, but I think that it will become clear later on as we go that these are equivalent descriptions. To measure and to localize are equivalent. And I think that's the profundity of this, because to measure a temperature is to localize movement at a certain scale and atomize a world, in the sense that a lot of stuff that is happening in a subatomic level doesn't really come into the measurement. So you kind of take a slice of being when you measure, right? Not in that hippie readings of quantum mechanics. I mean, simply in the sense that to measure and to determine what is the domain of operations that is relevant are equivalent operations, right? To determine that you're going to measure with a clock and with a ruler the movement of a billiard ball on a table is to determine a realm of operations. You could measure some other stuff there, right? So, and that would localize the billiard ball in a different world. So I think that this is, let's say, measurement, in my opinion, measurement is here what is count as one in being an event.
I think this is very close to the idea of count as one, I think.
But it's very profound, because if you take this seriously, it means that ontologically experimentation comes before experience. Experience is, let's say, messy experimentation, whereas experimentation is actually the concept, you know?
I would say experience is something like localized locality. You have locality, and then you have more localized locality, which is experience. If you go back to Hegel, what I think is interesting in the measure, one of the things that are interesting in the measure chapter is the fact that it is a gateway to essence, right? So it's not like there is something there before the measurement that you go there and measure. Somebody goes there and measure. No, you get to conceptualize something in the chapter on measure by its nodal line. There's a chapter. There's the sub topic of the nodal line. Don't know if you remember, but you know there's this plethora of different measures that, so to speak, constitutes the concretion of a thing in the world. But this does not give us its essence yet. So this is the gateway to the essence. But the thing is that what makes the consistency of the entity is the different measures, in a sense, the different relationships this entity has. We could paraphrase in Badiouian language, its degrees of similarity and dissimilarity in a world with other different entities. This constitutes the entity at that point before essence, right? So I think it's this metonymic conception of, you know, an entity at this point. You know the entity by a part of it which another entity has access to, something like that. So this is very similar to the account of the Transcendental he's offering. Like, degrees of similarity and dissimilarity that makes up a world that is itself resulting from the consistency of these relationships, not as something that comes before the measurement itself, something like this. I just wanted to add this.
Yeah,
it's very, very good.
But I do think there's a lot of stuff to take from this. I mean, in part 4, he also does something which I think is, from this perspective, is actually very enlightening into his methodology, which is he compares the being of numbers, right, in the sense of the ordering of numbers in the pages of a book, with the world of the book. And he says, well, under the world of the book, page 721 doesn't exist. And there's nothing to distinguish page 721 from 730. Both pages are not in the book. So, right, I got lost here in Rez's comment, but he compares, he says, look, you're not, when you're measuring, let's say, the pages based on the book, you're measuring, for example, from that perspective, page 200 and 201, in which one same argument is being developed. They are closer together than page 200 and 400, or 200 and 199, which was the end of the previous chapter. So you see that the degrees of identity and difference are affected by the world of the book, right? But you can also adopt, let's say, the measurement which is belonging itself. And belonging, as we know from like von Neumann ordinals and things like this, they give us a certain ordering of natural numbers where certain properties are invariant. So those two things will have to coexist. Let's say the belonging as, let's say, that which gives the inner structure of numbers and their being, from the structuring of that thing by the measure of a world, right?
Yeah, and actually in mathematics, measure theory is all about how do we define measures, how do we measure sets, right? Which are, it's like a secondary moment where sets themselves don't, besides cardinality, which is a very basic type of ordering, there are other ways to measure sets, the size of a set.
Yeah.
Should we read?
Yeah, sure. So, sorry for all of this, but I think it's useful.
Ideally, we should go to the end of the Hegel section today, but we'll see. What do you think?
Yeah, honestly, I'm happy if we are able to go through the Transcendental, the section 1, okay, and we can bring Hegel in as we go. I mean, just so I mean, I don't think it's that necessary to go in detail into, I don't know what you guys think, but into his discussion with Hegel. We're already doing that a bit anyway.
Just to understand what you're saying, I mean, if we don't get to the Hegel bit of Rez's text today, it's okay if I take it from there next week, nevertheless, regardless, this is the idea.
No, my personal position is that I'm more interested in us cutting through the meat of the concepts than going through page by page. So if we discuss Hegel only directly, and we only discuss indirectly what the contents, I don't think we're missing that much, you know.
Just because I think Badiou's take on Hegel is like slightly different from what we are discussing.
No, definitely it is. It's very different. Right. I agree.
His take is not about measure or essence. His take is about being and being there.
Appearance, yeah, being and being there, yes.
So it's the very beginning of logic. I just wanted to, I think this, because it interests me a lot, I know interests Regis, that a lot of people are interested in this. It might be interesting just to at least summarize his disagreement with Hegel, because it's very different from what we are talking about, actually. But okay, should we go on? Rezo?
Sure. So section 5 is, it must be possible to think in a world what does not appear within that world. Based on the non-being of the whole, we can argue for this thesis. If we cannot think of beings that do not appear in a world, we have to accept that everything that is thinkable is in that world, which makes the given world a universe. A notion that we saw is impossible. To complete this thought, it seems to me we have to remember another thought. We can think a being ontologically as a multiple being, and logically as a being there or appearing. So in our familiar example of number, we can think of number 2 in its ontological determination as an ordinal number, as well as think it in the appearance of 2 in a given world, such as a book. So if it were impossible to think the non-appearing or not being there of certain multiple beings in a given world, that means from the fact that we can think the multiple beings at the ontological level, then all those multiple beings must have appearing in that world. This is because otherwise we were unable to think them. This means that the given world we have in the given world, we have the appearing of all multiple beings that we can think ontologically, which means that the given world is the whole, which is absorbed. But you makes another argument which is interesting. The thinking of being there necessarily includes the possibility of a not being there, without which it would be identical to the thinking of being qua being. This should be the direct consequence of the addition of the operator of other discussed in the previous section. In the relation between Plato and Parmenides, the latter only had the idea of identity, same and not difference. But having the idea of difference, we should be able to think being there and its other, which is not being there. This harkens back to what was said previously about the logic of phenomenology requires richer operations than the operations in ontology. These arguments show that in order to think appearing, we ought to be able to think non-appearing and as argued previously, the same way that appearing is a matter of degree, so is non-appearing. So is non-appearing. This suggests that appearing and non-appearing are in fact degrees of transcendental operator, which we have previously recognized as being the operator of identity. Why operator of identity measures appearing and non-appearing? Because appearing is the appearing of a being whose appearance is recognizable insofar as its identity is determinable. Thus, the necessity of a minimal degree of identity in the end stems from the fact that words are in general not Parmenidean, which is instead the case for being as such, or the ontological, that is mathematical situation. They admit of absolute differences which are thinkable within appearing only insofar as non-appearing is also thinkable. This point, the absolute necessity of a minimum degree in appearing harkens back to the axioms of the transcendental logic and its 3 basic operations, one of which is minimum. In here, we are basically told that for any operator of identity to work, there must be a minimum degree of identity. Minimum identity means really difference. So why have a maximum identity as identical and define difference based on that, which is the opposite, and perhaps it would also work purely from a logical perspective? I think the reason is the natural understanding of degrees as a scalar measure. You cannot have high scalar measures unless you have a base to start from, based on which you build progressively toward the top of the scale. So we must assume that the operator of identity will have at least a minimum based on which we can have, for example, measures such as moderate and large. There is no transcendental operator to measure the intensity of appearing in itself. The transcendental operators that have been introduced measure the identity or difference of what appears, and not the appearing itself. This fact is stressed by Badiou in the following. Let us keep in mind, however, that strictly speaking, a transcendental measure always bears on the identity of difference of two beings in determinate world. When we speak of an evaluation of appearing as we have been doing from the start, this is only for the sake of expediency. For what is measured or evaluated by the transcendental organization of a world is in fact the degree of intensity of the difference of appearance of two things in this world, and not an intensity of appearance considered in itself. It is important to make a note here. Question of identity or difference, and thus the question of appearing, is twofold. The identity of an appearing to another in degrees, and the identity of an appearing to a pure being, also in degrees. But you had emphasized this in the previous section. The following passages confirms this understanding from the text. Insofar as the transcendental is concerned, it follows that the thinking of a non-apparent comes down to saying that the identity between an ontologically determinate being and every being that really appears in a world is minimal. In other words, nil for what is internal to this world, since it is identical to nothing that appears within a world, or which amounts to the same, absolutely different from everything that appears within it. It can be said, this being, that it does not appear within the given world. It is not there. This means that to the extent that its being is attested and therefore localized, this takes place somewhere else in another world, not here or not there. In the above, it is clear that one function of the operation of identity or difference is to measure the degree of identity between an ontological being to an appearing in a given world. In addition, we have the following operation as well. The transcendental can bring forth intra-worldly identities from absolute ontological differences. This is all the more so in that it plays upon degrees of identity, whence the intelligibility of the localization of beings. His example, pages 421 and 422, being almost identical in the world called a book, precisely shows that the function of identity operation is not just to speak to the essence of an appearance. In this case, determined beings that are natural numbers 421 and 422, that ontologically are non-identical as any other number, but their relation to each other in a given world, i.e. the appearance of these two ontological beings in another world, may have a degree of identity that is close to nil. The delicate point is that it always through an evaluation of minimal identity that I can pronounce on the other non-apparent. It makes no sense to transform the judgment such and such a being is not there into an ontological judgment. There is no being of not being there. What I can say about such a being with respect to its localization, with respect to its situation of being, is that its identity to such and such a being of this situation or this world is minimal. This is nil according to the transcendental of this world. Appearing, that is the local or worldly attestation of being, is logical through and through, which is to say, rational. It follows that non-apparent conveys a nil degree of relation and never a non-being pure and simple. The ontological non-being is thus different than the logical non-being. And while the former will result into the latter, the whole cannot appear in any world, i.e. its appearances has a degree of nil. The latter does not result in the former.
Yeah, I think that here we see the first, I mean, for people intimate with early Badiou work, and Reza, don't you feel like this is, I mean, he's certainly trying to make a more general claim, but the statement, the non-being, there is no being of what is not placed, right? Just because it's not placed, it doesn't have a particular being of being unplaced. It's simply not interiorly determined by that space, right? It is very similar to his argument in Mark and Lack against Miller and against that view of completeness of logical systems. And if you rate, I mean, he made this argument that, you know, Frege and then Miller both chose to take as a very profound thing that Frege's choice of a concept without an object was something which is different from itself. And he says, well, but you could have done the same thing by first defining a domain, let's say the domain of all black things, and then saying the concept of a blue thing. For that domain, it will be empty. You don't need to give it this sort of fundamental metaphysical
or ontological
tone to find something which has no object under a concept, right? New appearance.
Absolutely the same.
It's the same, exactly. It's the same argument, but I think it's interesting because Frege's idea of grounding the idea of concept without object on this sort of fundamental ontological property, right? There is no such thing like Leibniz in principle of identity. You can see that for Badiou, he really takes all the way this idea of localization, this situating the domain of reference as an essential part of thinking, right? He really does never accepts, and that's why we were talking last time, that there are no general claims in Badiou's philosophy about situations, like, because you begin from claiming that, okay, what is the domain you're talking about? You want a general framework to make strong claims about the need of defining domains. But you don't have a general domain you call ontology. Ontology is the theory of why you need and how you need multiple domains, right? Multiple situations, multiple counts as one, and everything that follows from this multiplicity. It's not a theory of one all, right? And here you get the sort of consequence of this, because you get something which I find very profound, and the reason why Badiou is not a philosopher of difference, which is that for him, negation, non-appearance, non-being, in the sense of non-existence, is a category of indifference. It's not a category of difference. You don't arrive at what is not there by moving towards differentiation or talking about something which is virtual or whatever. You don't need any of that sort of complicated machinery. All you need is this idea of regionalization, situation, looking for domains of reference before you evaluate what is there and what is not there. Then the things that are not there, they are indifferent to that domain, right? You don't have a criteria of differentiation. So he's in a sort of philosophy of indifference in that sense, because difference is always a localized principle. There is no general process of differentiation. That's why he says Deleuze is a philosopher of the one, ultimately.
Yeah, because it seems to be inconsistent. If he had a concept of differentiation in that sense, he would have to postulate a whole, and he said the whole is not. So
yeah, so you need to take the other option. Yeah.
Yeah, to have a point of view wherein you can look at all the processes of differentiation as you have in the Deleuzean philosophy, which is predicated on the existence of a one all, as you said before. This strikes me as very familiar to the Carnapian, again, the Carnapian framework of, differentiating between internal questions and external questions of a certain domain that is taken as existent, it's basically the Carnapian sense of ontology, like it's a link. But for Carnap, it's a linguistic framework. It's not this mathematical machinery. It's just a linguistic framework which will be assessed by Badiou. This thesis of the linguistic frameworks being responsible for the domains of what exists will be assessed by Badiou in section 4 of the book 2, which I shall maybe comment on next time. But anyway, there is this similarity, which is in Carnap and also in Russell, in some of the proponents of the early analytic tradition, is the idea of reducing and localizing is exactly that which will avoid the inconsistency that comes with totalization. So this is very interesting relationship. I'm still tackling exactly where the differences are. Some of them are commented upon by Badiou, but nevertheless, there's a lot of similarities to Aquinas and Carnapian framework for thinking about this question.
Yeah, I think a good way of putting is, can we maintain the prudence of looking for domains of reference that we find in a certain analytic tradition without having to espouse, let's say, a sort of emptying out of what else can there be? Because the only way you can maintain the concept that domains of reference come before differentiation or whatever is through a linguistic model. Well, we differentiate because we have certain domains of sense and things like this, blah, blah. The trade-off of this is that things that don't play so well into that idea, like, unnameable relations of love, or, the coming up of almost, let's say, not private language, but intimate language of a political movement where things mean what they mean there and things like that. All this gets harder to account for. So we want to be able to maintain all of that, which analytic tradition developed. And Badiou, I've been reading this book of his to write a review called "Can Politics Be Thought?" It's a book from 1988, I think, and he's talking to students of Derrida and Lyotard and so on. And his main argument is, you guys talk about the political because you have no idea what a political reference is. Like, you don't know how to point something out in reality that is political. That's why you guys have this crazy theory. So, to me, he sounds very analytical with this. Like, you don't even know what you mean when you say.
I think it's more specific than analytic. It sounds very Wittgensteinian.
Yes. So you see that he has that trust. He has that trust.
You're postulating property because you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but it's very crazy, the book. You have that analytic approach, but then you want to save, let's say, the benefits of a sort of existential trope of novelty and subjective engagement. So you want to keep the benefit of that privileging of domains over concepts, but you want to do it in a framework that also has space for that kind of very robust and kind of crazy theory of subjectivity. So you get there why he needs to change from linguistic to mathematical. He needs a broad machinery that doesn't really require you to choose, right, between these two things. I think that this part of the book makes it very apparent that he's again making the claim, look, you won't have any of your good, nice continental concepts without a domain. Like, don't ask of negation, difference, and things to be kind of floating on the vague, space of being. Yeah, well, that's a good T-shirt. You need to
Well, that's a good catch.
You need a situation. So I think that this is very strong statement that he did it in a critical form elsewhere, but here is very, very affirmative in that sense.
But it is very important to recognize the parallel that the project that Badiou is following here with what motivates analytical philosophy. Because I think the premise is very, very similar, especially when it comes to plurality of the logic and how the inexistence of the whole results in that plurality. I think that's something that we need to emphasize as we go along to see, like JP and others who are more familiar with the body of work that we call analytical philosophy, to draw parallels between this and between analytical philosophy and what we are doing here, because I don't think that anybody has explored this.
Yeah, I agree. There's little bibliography on that take on Badiou.
Yeah, actually, me and Gabriel, we are thinking about writing some precisely this relationship. So we are actually cooking up an article. So we'll see.
Okay, continue.
I'll be back in 1 second.
So section 6, the conjunction of two apparents in a world. At this point, what has been established is two basic understandings. Number one, appearing is something different than being. Number two, appearing can be identical through an operation of identity via its degree of identity or difference to a pure being or to another appearance. The next question that Badiou tackles here is the question of consistency. He has earlier mentioned that the consistency of the world of appearing is something that cannot have any root in ontology, i.e. there is no ontological ground for having consistent and stable worlds. So how is that the world of appearance is consistent? Recall that Badiou earlier laid out a simple axiomatic for phenomenology. That is from page 103. It is very striking that this phenomenology is absolutely complete with only three operations bound together by a simple axiomatic. A minimum of appearance is given. B, the possibility of conjoining the values of appearance of two multiples and therefore of any finite number of multiples. C, the possibility of globally synthesizing the values of appearances of any number of multiples, even if there is an infinity of them. At this point, it seems that he has shown the first operation, the operation of identity responsible for grounding the appearances, operator in the above list, the first operator in the above list. Consistency will, at the very least, depend on the operation of conjoin, operator B, in the above list, and most likely also operator of envelope, operator C, and a future derived operator of dependence, not in the above list. Badiou so far has not provided a justification on why consistency is complete by having the two operators, A and C. The topic of this section is the operator of conjoin or operator B. What is the operator of conjoin? Operator of conjoin is what sustains the co-appearance of two beings within a world, which is one of the crucial aspects of the consistency of a world. What does this conjoin allow us to do? It allows us to evaluate the common part of the two things, common in terms of appearing. This part is common to the extent that they are there in this world. Badiou then enumerates three cases. They can be distilled in the following way. One, the two appearances are inclusive. When one of them is determinative, example of the ivy and the red leafage. The appearance of ivy is inclusive in the red leafage. Two, the appearances are intercalary. The two have in common a relation with a third, whose intensity, its identity in the world, is less than the other two. The appearance of the red leafage grown on the side of the wall and the house, that the wall is its side. The appearance of the wall has less intensity of either appearances of the house and the red leafage. Three, the two appearances are disjoint. They have no common parts, or the intensity of their common parts is nil. The appearance of the red leafage and the noise of the motorcycle. So at the end, the measure of whether two beings there are conjoined will come down to the measure of the intensity of their largest common part in comparison to the measure of intensity of each being. One, if the largest measure is nil, then the two beings are disjointed. Two, if the largest measure is not nil, but less than either intensities, the beings there are intercalary. Three, if the largest part is equal to one of the intensities, then the two beings are conjoined. The measure of the largest common part cannot be bigger than either intensity. One reminder here, when we speak of intensity of appearance, the transcendental values do not directly measure intensities of appearance in themselves, but rather differences or identities. When we speak of the value of appearance of a being, we are really designating a sort of synthetic summary of the values of transcendental identity between this being in this world and all other beings appearing in the same world. So far, we are talking about conjoining two beings there. But what are beings there? They are degrees in a network of differences. The identity of each being being there really boils down to how much different it is from other beings there. For example, in the case of the characters in the opera, if the difference of Melisande to all other wives were large, then she had a more recognizable appearance than the case where her difference with all other wives was weak, i.e., they are almost identical, that is unrecognizable from each other. So the three modes of conjunction above, i.e. the measure of the largest common part, is between the intensity of differences by situating identities, i.e. bring beings there with the networks of differences. Network of differences. Coming back to the original point I raised at the beginning of this section, Badiou says that at the end, that the logical stability of a word deploys conjoined operator or differential networks. Let's pause a moment and think this logical stability, what this logical stability is and how the above sense of conjoined operator can contribute to this logical stability. When Badiou says that ontology does not guarantee that order, not guarantee the order, it cannot mean that situations are chaotic or can break up at moment's notice. Ontology does guarantee the normalcy, that is, orderly gathering of multiplicities under the operation of count as one. It also provides operations for an orderly construction of multiplicities with unlimited complexity. So the chaos that Badiou is talking about or is speaking of cannot be the chaos that is inherent in ontology. What it means could be that the laws of ontology is not enough to explain the normalcy that we see in the world of appearing. What is the main complexity in the world of word that ontology lacks the required rigor to handle? We saw one, intensity of appearing and the complexity of identification of appearing. Within the logic of phenomenology, there are more situations that ontology alone can resolve. And we saw them at the beginning of this section. We may be able to categorize them as the relation of appearances and synthesis of appearances. Badiou claims that the operator of identity, along with the operator of conjoin and envelope, can together ground the orderliness that we observe in the world of appearance. I think a greater question is this: ontology has one sole operation, count, and logic has three operations, identity, conjoin, and envelope. But who runs these operations in light of the fossil argument? Are these operations inherent to being and being there, or are a reflection over being and being there?
Yeah, I think that those questions, we partially dealt with them, because this approach that thinks, I mean, I don't know if you guys had that impression as well, but now that we discussed this idea of measure, you can see that the whole time until here, all the way from this parts 5 and 6, it was about evaluation. The concept of value, evaluation, and measure, they're very connected, right? And he puts it in one point that you've quoted, that in a certain sense, things appear to the transcendental, right? So let's say it's interesting because if you take our classic understanding, you have this idea that three terms go together, right? subjective, transcendental, synthesis. And he decouples the subjective from this other two, and you get transcendental as, let's say, it's analytic sense of disseminating difference and identity within a given domain, and synthesis as well, which is weird because the envelope, well, it's the part that we're going to read now, right? Because the envelope actually turns out to be something quite special, because you could say, and I think the question that you propose is at the realm, exactly at the point of this, we could say that, well, I understand why the spaces or the constraints under which difference and identity, like the constraints of identity and difference in a world, are immanent. But the synthesis of all of this, let's say, sort of the way that this is brought together, can still be extrinsic, right? We could still say that the envelope is, let's say, only perceivable from the outside somehow. So you need a point outside of a world to talk about the synthesis of that world. And what he will show is that the actual apparatus of synthesis, which is the envelope, it always gives us another degree in the world, right? So the question, these things appear to be different or identical, has an answer. But then that answer, let's say, not the answer, but the measure of the whole section, for example, of that world, which is already, let's say, the synthesis of all these differences and appearances, that section is also in the world, right? So the synthetic point of view is also embedded in not only the analytic, right? You could, from an analytic point of view, all these principles of difference, of ordering, and so on and so forth, they are intrinsic. Okay, these operators work in such and such a way. But he then makes it equivalent to state that for these things to be taken together and considered in this way, it's also the synthetic aspect of it is also intrinsic, right?
Yeah, you mean you're mentioning the analytic aspect as what the recognizing which objects are there within a domain, and the synthetic, the fact that this object has appeared as consistent with the domain we are taking as object inquiry. This is the difference you are making.
Yeah.
Between this. Okay, just to be clear, and I think this makes. I was talking to EJ here in the sidebar about this comparison between, you know, the Carnackian sense and the Badiouian sense of segregation, localization, that is a means to avoid, you know, the Barber paradox and all of that. So this is why you don't have the whole and all of that. This is kind of answers why Badiou is not, in a sense, is not committed to something like a solution like stratification. Like, for instance, you know, the constructivist approach that you take from Carnap, or new foundations from Quine, which needs stratification into object languages and meta languages, so you don't have the paradox, because you avoid having self-reference of the whole of a certain language within the language itself. You need to reference a certain language from the point of view of the meta language. So you have this stratification that solves this problem from the analytic point of view. It seems that the fact that the synthesis is intrinsic to a world kind of avoids the necessity of the stratification, in a sense.
Yes.
So the stratification is there because actually the point of view is still a point, even if the analytics are kind of hostile to, you know, phenomenology and all that, the point of view, it seems to be, in some sense, it's still a cognitive, subjective point of view, wherein, okay, how do I know? I must have a framework, and the framework is relative to somebody, right? So you have to construct a framework, and the framework recognizes a domain of objects, and then you have certain rules in order to avoid paradox, and there you go. Because you are locating synthesis within the intrinsicality of a given world, so to speak, you avoid the necessity of this stratification in languages and meta languages, in a sense. It seems to me to go there.
Yes. No, I think that this is important because, sorry.
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Because Gabriel mentioned Mark and Lack. Actually, in Mark and Lack, he shows how various different definitions can be incorporated into, like so to speak, axioms can be incorporated into the language of a particular logic through the operation of stratification. He actually demonstrates one of these, which is the creation or the devising of the concept of zero within the original set of logical operations that did not have the concept of zero. So stratification was something that he was, at least back in time, was arguing for.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's inconsistent, Reza. Just to clarify, I think that what brings the two things you guys said together is that he has, let's say, a theory of ontological certification, not a theory of linguistic certification. So rather than say we need to stratify so that our treatment of language is rigorous, he was using a logical system as a situation, not as a language to talk about a situation, right? So certification in Mark and Lack was closer to the fact that situations have multiple levels of synthesis and there is no total synthesis. Like I think the argument on stratification in Mark and Lack concerned more the argument about a world than an argument about a logic, let's say, formal logic, and if it's stratified, right? It was treating formal logic as a world.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and the target of his critique, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not as familiar with Mark and Lack. I just recently read it. The target of the critique was exactly the point of view that accepts the inconsistency, right? It accepts, that goes all the way down through and accepts inconsistency as legitimate, right? Which seems to be the point of view that Miller is defending and which he's attacking in a sense. So stratification.
His point is
actually the classical move. No, if you don't want to accept inconsistency, to accept the emergence of self-reference paradoxes, you must stratify. So it's really classical. But the difference between somebody like Carnap or Quine and Badiou seems to be that the stratification for Badiou is immanent to situations, whereas for Quine and Carnap, the stratification is a work of a constructive method that approaches situations. Yes, something like that.
This is, I think, I realize this now, and I think that this is actually, Reza, I'm not sure if you agree, but like if you're really being an event with this sort of questions in mind, I think we talked about this. It's very, very. It's one of the big, let's say, victories of the book to propose a framework in which the distinction between presentation and representation is a functional one between things of the same quality, right? But when it's, let's say, the trade-off is you don't know anymore what ontology is talking about. It's not talking about any situation in particular, but what you gain with that is that the same formal means that describe situations describe what you call the state of situation, because sets and power sets are both sets, but power sets give you, let's say, the domain of possible representations, because all the ways you could group together elements of a set are contained in the power set. So basically, the functions that connect you from the set to all subsets of the power set are all the predicates possible. It's a theory of predication, extracted homogeneously from the same material, which is set theory. So you get presentation and representation produced. You produce the distinction between things and names. rather than depart from it. And the funny thing is that we do the same thing here with analyticity and synthetic approach. You derive the analytical or the synthetic point of view of a world from the same formal machinery. You don't need to suppose it. Things are distinct, and I conjoin them in my way, right? Analytic and synthetic, let's say. You get both operations, both points of view or both directions. You produce that distinction between them from the same formal machinery, right? Conjunction, envelope, and minimum gives you the means to describe the differences, immanent differentiation, and is the same machinery for synthesization of, regions of similarity and coherence and things like this. So you don't get an ontological distinction between analytic and synthetic. You produce that distinction within a world, so you can have, let's say, a specialization of this. Each world can divide itself in strata in the way that's appropriate to that world. You don't need to have a general theory of this. In the same way that once you have the distinction of presentation and representation coming out of the same machinery, you can have a theory of a state for a situation, right? That's the contribution that Badiou gave in being an event. It doesn't give you a theory of the state or theory of being. It gives a theory of the state of a situation.
Badiou is very, as a matter of fact, not only provides this theory, but on a negative side, I think he has, in Mark and Lack, for example, has an argument that why an immanent, a non-immanent, I should say, a non-immanent stratification, like the way that epistemology does, is ideological, is not scientific, for example. So for him, the only valid way of a stratification is an immanent, to your terminology, JP, is an immanent stratification.
Yes. So, and a good example of this is that he opposes in Mark and Lack analytic Fregean account of set theory and logic from Gödel's development. He says Gödel shows what is actual stratification and the limits of stratification in logical systems of a certain strength. That's the immanent development of what stratification immanently is to the world of logic. Extrinsically claiming that, well, concept without objects is, fundamental to reality because thinking cannot do without it. That's totally extrinsic to the actual development of the machinery that Frege himself was putting to use, right? I think that, yeah.
Using the language of this book, you can basically confront what Frege did as the assumption of the whole exists, because actually they are stepping out of a world to the world in order to provide a definition of the objects, concepts without objects.
Yes. This is something.
But this is exactly historically, because one of the motivators of the pluralization of worlds is exactly the fact that the whole is not. And historically, I mean, the history of logic, the paradox of the whole, of the existence of the whole, emerges within Frege, within the Russellian objection to Frege. And he points out that the Fregean idea that any well-defined property must have a set instantiating it cannot be the case without there being already a set before, which is the solution, the Zermelo-Fraenkel solution that Badiou adopts in being an event, given a certain set.
But the question here is, the question that Badiou is asking is, where are you standing when you issue the question of the concept without an object? Where are you? You are not definitely in the world, because you are getting that concept from somewhere outside of the world, right? So where is it that you are even asking this question? So for him, the only valid place that you can ask this question is within the world itself. That's why the concept without object, which is the concept of zero, must come from an immanent stratification as opposed to being smuggled from somewhere outside of the work.
And I think that it's very interesting because you can find, let's say, the symptomatic points. I mean, we had that lecture together, Caron, about, you know, the all turns in philosophy being, I propose that all turns, like linguistic turn, ontological turn, they're usually a way to avoid the traumatic thing that is usually connected with mathematics. And I think that you can see that very nicely in this story, because the moment that Frege represents to himself his own doing, because one thing is what he did logically, in the immanence of logical development. Another thing is his own philosophical take on it, which is not the same. And the moment that he translates, I mean, Badiou's argument is not that there are no concepts without objects, but that there are infinite concepts without objects, and they're not ontologically or fundamentally so. They are so relative to the logical system you are constructing. So you can find a concept without object easily. So his point was, when Frege did this move towards a philosophical account, rather than simply accepting that he was smuggling it, because you can smuggle it from anywhere, he, let's say, set the tone for a series of reproaches and corrections that all reproduce the problem. They all try to solve the problem philosophically through a philosophy of language, rather than logically and through logical systems. So choosing Zermelo's axiomatic as a solution is neither choosing the paradoxical philosophical account, where we assume the inconsistency of being, nor the philosophical stratification account, where philosophically we say we need this. We don't need this. Like, you can do it. It's different. So it's funny because there are actually three ways, right? The way of inconsistency, the way of stratification, and the way of immanent stratification, which is always, let's say, kind of a messy stratification. It has limits. It's constrained by the power of the language of that particular model and things like this, right? So that's why I think that Badiou's initial insight was to substitute a theory of language for a theory of models. So this account that goes from Frege, then back to Zermelo, then through Hilbert and Gödel, and following closely that line of inquiry, it leads to model theory. It doesn't lead to a theory of language in general, right? And his whole theory of language is, let's say, developed on top of a theory of models, which are imminent to being an event and to all the results that he's interested in. It's a kind of a third way, which is also Lautmann's way. Lautmann let's say, returns to this whole development and says, this is the history of mathematical modeling and the relation between structure and formalism, not a relation between formalisms and language, right? So there is a nice moment there that we can see the debate being established in a way that makes it almost impossible to unravel back afterwards from between Frege and Russell, I think. It had to be a Hegelian traitor like Russell too. Not even criticize things correct, not produce an immanent critique.
Yeah, I think it's a more complex than that, but I don't think we can delve into it right now. But you know, because concepts without objects, the Fregean thing is the fact that everything has to be instantiated. So if you accept this as an axiom, you have to instantiate like numbers and propositions, all that, and you have a world. You have a world for that, like
Actually,
a Platonic world
guys,
of objects.
I have a suggestion.
Yeah.
I have a suggestion. Why don't we take this topic and make it a standalone presentation? If JP, you want to take this up, for example.
Yeah.
I'm volunteering.
I would need a couple of weeks. Not next week. Yeah. Maybe we could do like this. I could do part 3 next week, like the formal version of what you were presenting, Reza. And then within the part about linguistic logic, which is part 4 of the book, I could develop a little bit something like that, and maybe we could also do something together with Gabriel because we are writing about it. So we can develop something for like 2 weeks time, not next week. I think it's kind of heavy for me to summarize part 3 and then have a proper treatment of these issues within philosophy of language, Frege, and all of that.
Sounds good.
So
if
we have a timeline for 2 weeks, I can do it.
Sounds good. So I propose that. Also, wanted to say if you can send us like a reading list that we can do for your presentation, that would be great.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But don't give us like 700 pages.
Just so before we move on,
it's little articles like Frege's concept and object, this kind of thing. I mean, which you are right. It's a philosophical interpretation of what he had done in principles of arithmetic and how they call it, the Glyphschrift. And it's all very different from the philosophical, Platonistic, hard Platonist interpretation, the third world interpretation of all these results. They are independent results in a sense, but that is not the same as saying there's no world for that. He just postulated one. There is a world for that in a sense. I think the question is a little more subtle than that.
No, of course. I think it's not generous to put it in these terms, but it's nice to put it in these terms. No,
it's fun to put it in this.
No. It is very low res kind of approach to it, but I think it just gives the general gist of an argument. But
yeah. As I said, I think we are on the right track, but I mean it's more subtle than that a little bit.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to mention before we move on, just because it took me a while to realize this, and our friend who was here, Martin, who were talking about his interest in object-oriented ontology, and I mean, one thing that is funny about Logics of Worlds is that when we get to the chapter on relation, it's very anticlimactical, because everyone talks about relation and on relational ontology and category theory has to do with relation, blah, blah. When you get to the chapter on relations, you get that Leibnizian argument that, relations are actually, let's say, properties of objects. They're not themselves the givers of property, right? They're conditioned by the objects themselves. And it gives the idea that Badiou gives a sort of privilege to objects over relations. But it's at exactly the point where we are now that we can see that it's actually because everything is so fucking relational from the ground up that when we get to the appearance of relation, and this is actually a beautiful, now that I think of it, Dennis, this might be interesting for our whole project with Marx and Badiou, because there is this classic problem with, it's not even in the chapter on fetishism, but it's a problem in the relation between Capital Volume 1 and Capital Volume 3. Capital Volume 1 is all about social relations based on commodity exchange, so on and so forth. And when you get to the third book, Marx says, look, commodities don't appear. What appears is price. Value has absolutely no reality. And then you say, okay, but wasn't it all built upon this? How can this have disappeared, And now I see that this is very similar to what happens here, because you get it. Everything is built on evaluation and relation. But when it comes to relation itself, relation appears totally different as a concept, let's say as an operational thing, than the way that it works in the analytic of this logical analysis, whatever you want to call it.
Yes, I agree. I think it can, this conversation can be related to what we're talking about Hegel as well, because the object in the Hegelian sense is also relationally constructed. As I said, it's not just my reading, but a bunch of people read the measure chapter as a kind of a metonymic account of what it is to be an entity, what it is to be an object, wherein you have the part for the whole or the property for the thing,
Yeah.
So you have like a thing is like this set of properties that emerge in its relationship to other things.
Yes.
And there is some core to it, which ironically has something to do with object-oriented philosophy that withdraws in a sense, because essence withdraws any everything that is apparent in this metonymic way, wherein one entity relates to another entity, and you have this set of properties that, okay, I have the nodal line of water, all the temperatures where water changes states, and then I have to somewhat integrate that into a kind of a oneness. This oneness is a thing that is there, but then you have to ask a different question, and then it opens up to the question of essence suddenly, right?
Yeah, but
so
I think
there's also a relationship there. Right?
Yes. No, I think that the connection is very profound, because Badiou is making sure we understand that by appearance, he's not saying something appears. When we say appearance, we're saying the identity or difference between evaluated multiples appear, right? So to appear is, let's say, is a relation, that the relation that appears, right? Is the evaluation that appears. So is the measuring that appears, not the thing measured, because there is not even that concept. We're going to arrive at the idea of object afterwards, but we begin with this. So the building block is a very weird idea of relation, right? Which is this sort of network of evaluations. If you then get this network evaluations and call it an object, it comes much after. But what you actually got is this sort of field of measurements. That's actually, let's say, what appears, right? Yeah. Just not to give you an idea that we're talking about a bunch of stuff appearing and relations between them come afterwards. No, it's relations all the way down. The chapter on relation is something totally different from this, right? It's let's say, is how do relations between things appear? That's something else. But when you ask that question, you're actually asking the question, how do relations between relations appear, or something like that? Yeah. It connects appearance to measure again, right? As you said.
Should we go on?
Yeah.
Okay, let's continue. Where was I? Did I unshare my screen?
Right now, it's not shared.
So 7 is an envelope.
Yeah.
I would start this section differently. The issue here is, how can we claim that the disjointed beings there are in the same world versus different worlds? As a matter of process, this question should be asked for all modes of conjoining. But in the case of conjoined and intercalary beings, the answer is perhaps obvious, i.e. the common part must belong to the world that is common to two beings there. However, in the case of disjoint beings there, the answer is not so obvious, because precisely there is no common part between the two beings there to ground the argument for the same world between them. So the question in this section is, what's the ground for positing that two disjoint beings there belong to the same world? This is a far-reaching question, because it touches upon the ground for enveloping a region of being to be in the same world without any explicit relation among the beings there in that world. The regional stability of the world comes down to this: if you take a random fragment of a given world, the beings which are there in this fragment possess, both with respect to themselves and relative to one another, differential degrees of appearances indexed to the transcendental order of this world. The fact that nothing which appears within this fragment, including its disjunctions, those conjunctions whose value is nil, can sunder the unity of the world, means that the logic of the world guarantees the existence of a synthetic value subsuming all degrees of appearance of the beings that co-appear in this fragment. The guarantee for a collection of disjoint appearances to belong to the same world is the transcendental logic that unites them together. The relevant operation of this logic is called envelope. We call envelope of a part of the world that being whose differential value of appearance is the synthetic value adequate to that part. The operation of envelope itself has an identity, differential value of appearance. That is the synthetic value based on the value of appearances of all the beings there in the envelope. The systematic existence of the envelope presupposes that given any collection of degrees, those which measure the intensity of appearance of beings in a part of the world, that the transcendental order contains a degree superior or great or equal to all the degrees in the collection. It subsumes them all, which is also the smallest degree to enjoy this property. It grips as closely as possible the collection of degrees assigned to the different beings there of the part in question. Coming back to the question pertaining to this section, we would like to know what does give us the license to call disjoint beings there are part of the same world. The transcendental logic of appearing, which is transcendental to beings there, and which is the ground for the unity of each random fragment to belong to the same world. The operator envelope creates a phenomenon on its own, a new appearing, made of the appearing of a number of other appearances. This is finally what differentiates this operator from the operator of conjoin. In that operator, we measure the intensity of the common part, but in this operator, we are not creating a common part. We are simply aggregating in a fragment of this world an appearance that signifies this fragment.
One thing that that you mentioned that I think it's important. I mean, of course, this will become clearer, I think, with the formalization, and I mean, it could become clearer. But I think that the thing that it's also very, very, very important to mention is that, well, we just saw him constructing then the idea of minimality, the idea of conjunction, and the idea of synthesis of envelope. And we are approaching this with this premise that the idea that this local consistency of a world that is equivalent to the relative identity and difference of what composes it, and that this is given by a certain operational domain, that this is a process of evaluation of multiples, right? But evaluation or measure doesn't mean a total ordering, right? So this is the profound reason why this is interesting, or that this is rich, is that you should think about this ordering as a tree-like or a rhizomatic, if you will, kind of network, rather than a sort of, because measure, you can go to that sort of ruler-like idea of ordering where things are either below or above each other, never disconnected, right? But the argument that comes to the fore when you join the argument of disconjunction and synthesis, right? Things can be disjointed, absolutely different. They're to the point of being incommensurate, and they're still in the same world. That already suggests that in an intuitive level, that what we're talking about with these evaluations of appearance, degrees of appearance, so on and so forth, it's not really a measure in that kind of common sense term, right? Where either it's below or above in a sort of measuring stick. Yes, exactly. It's so this sort of I think that this argument that appears at the end of part 7, and especially in the way that Reza framed it, like, great, this logic allowed us, this machinery with the minimal and the conjunction allowed us to think about, right, the difference between not being there and not and being totally different, right? So we have absolute difference, but why are these things in the same world? And this is what the idea of envelope suggests, that you can find in this sort of weird network the point where you get, let's say, a degree of appearance that kind of includes all the ones below, right? So you can only see the commonality if you move to this synthesis, let's say. I think that the example of the motorcycle sound with the wall is very nice, because you have this sort of tranquil landscape and you have this thing abruptly invading, but that doesn't mean that the motorcycle is in another world. But to arrive at the synthesis, or to the point of view in a certain weak sense, from which they are both in the same world, you need to think about the envelope of that scene as being different than simply the location of the wall, right?
But I think the order, I get what you're saying, but I think the order, again, I come back to an original comment I made. The order of this the construction should not be since envelope exists, since then synthesis exists. It is that we know that synthesis exists in this joint, or apparently disjoint appearances. How could we say that they belong to the same world? We know that already. And for this, he says that then there must be an operator, which is called envelope, that basically pieces together, sutures together disjoint appearing with each other. He's not deriving the synthesis from envelope. I think he's deriving envelope from the experience or the empirical fact of synthesis.
No, I don't see a problem with that. I think that's the same thing. My point is just how this affects our idea of what it means to evaluate, right? We're talking about an idea of transcendental, or an idea of evaluating appearance that includes incommensurability. That's not because you could say that that's the limit for measuring. Well, if the world concerns its immanent measures, immanent evaluations, then when there is absolute distinction, we're talking about different worlds. And this is not the case. It doesn't contradict what you're saying.
Yeah, okay. So number 8, the conjunction between a being there and a region of its world. The phenomenological question in this section is this: in terms of intensity of appearance, what is the value of conjunction between a single phenomenon and a given fragment of a world? This is not a question of conjoining one appearance to another, but an appearance to the envelope of appearances. The answer is that this value depends on the one that measures the conjunction of the appearing outside of the fragment with all the enveloped appearances, taken one by one. This conjunction will create a new envelope whose value will be higher than all the enveloped appearances, including the new conjoined one. Quote, in conceptual terms, we will simply say that the value of the conjunction between an apparent and an envelope is the value of the envelope of the local conjunctions between this apparent and all apparents of the envelope in question, taken one by one.
But just before we move on, just to clarify, I think it connects to this, but also to what you said before. There is something that is not simply finding the right operator to formalize an intuition. Like if you selected a passage from page 129 that says, the regional stability of the world comes to this, and then he explains. But the phrase before this one, the statement before this one in the same paragraph says, right, he just mentioned the motorcycle appeared, you could assume that it would lead to the decomposition of the world, and then he says it doesn't. As you said, something synthesizes the motorcycle into that scene, right? But then he says, and this is what comes right before your quote, he says, all of this I can do without my gaze, without my consciousness, without my about turn, which registers the density of the earth under the liquidity of the sky. So the whole point is that the envelope is a way of talking about synthesis where the synthetic point of view is part of the world, is an appearance itself, right? The envelope is equally measured. The envelope is not the measuring in a sort of transcendental sense, transcendent sense, right? So there is something that is gained because it's true, it's compatible with an intuition. Disjoint things can be synthesized, but it does so in such a way that the envelope has a particular value on this partial ordering. It's not, let's say, outside of it, right? So the envelope of a certain region is a region. That is something added, I think, to the intuition, right? So he makes clear, he strongly emphasizes that this has nothing to do with me perceptually, let's say, grasping or cognizing that there is a synthesis. The synthesis itself is in the world, right? So there is an argument to be made that's counterintuitive within that intuitive formalization.
Yeah, I guess you're saying the same thing.
Yes, I just wanted to...
I sense that the only thing that I want to emphasize is that the transcendental operations that he's coming with, I don't think that he's trying to construct the experiences, or I should say the actual appearances based on these transcendental operators. He's the other way around. He says that the consistency of appearance, which has to do with local identity, which has to do with the relation of two appearances together, and also the putting together a fragment of the world of appearances that are not related to each other, which we are all experiencing, can be theorized using these operators. So he's developing a set of operations based on direct empirical observations. That is what I'm trying to say. Since there is such a thing as an envelope or synthesis of disjoint appearances, how could we make sense of that in this transcendental logic? It makes sense. We have to account in our transcendental logic for an operator to do that. All I'm trying to say is emphasize on his empirical and non-metaphysical approach to this.
No, I agree with that. I just think that the way that you described it made it seem like this, I would call counterintuitive fact that, let's say, your perception that there is a synthesis is distinct from the synthesizing operation of the world, that this is counterintuitive. This is not empirically in a vague sense of we all recognize this and we want to formalize our intuition, because you could say that this is not an intuitive, commonsensical definition of what it means to take a certain part of the world, but it can be it might be just two ways of arguing for the same thing. I don't think that there's a disagreement.
But my argument has a flaw in it, and that the flaw is that it has to do with again, it has to do with what Dennis was saying, the assumption of having an agent or a subject who is experiencing this, right? That's the flaw I have in what I am arguing for.
Yeah, I think that is a flaw, but I think it makes visible a certain way of understanding why Badiou is insisting upon a kind of objective phenomenology. And I think if you go to if you appeal to the idea of an empirical investigation, I think Badiou, the justification for this account of Badiou's of what a world is and of that synthesis being intrinsic to the world, not to the subject that is looking at the world, is the very fact that in our synthesis as subjects, like as cognitive subjects, we are constrained, right? So there are constraints that are there. We can't really do anything with anything. Like we are not free to do anything with anything else. Things are proposing stuff that can be done to them. So in a sense, there is a consistency that belongs to the thing, not to the way I see the thing. So, and this has been a kind of a flaw of the alternate account. I mean, the kind of linguistic, idealistic account that thinks that in order to, I will now use my Solar's internal phrase. In order to escape the myth of the given, in a sense, we have to
The myth of what?
commit myth of the given. The idea that the categorical structure of the world imprints in our mind like a seal on wax, something like this, like a kind of this kind of realism about the world, right? So the Salesian way is kind of is trying to build a kind of transcendental realism wherein you approach the real by fashioning concepts that are of our own, you know, our own construction, right? So the real is not imprinting directly to the mind. This is kind of a Kantian renewal of Kant's philosophy in the Salesian way, in a sense. So this is just a turn of phrase, but there's this worry that we might go to a kind of given account of the real. But even Sellers says that there is a kind of givenness that is not problematic because we are constrained. There are, you know, we can't really do anything with anything conceptually. We are not producing worlds purely by manipulating concepts. So in a sense, I think the objective phenomenology points to is a solution to that, in a sense, because of course it is a framework that somebody come up with, in the case Alain Badiou, but it is also a response to the fact that we are not the only instance that is responsible for the way the world appears. The way we have a contribution. This is mainly the truth that is in the critique of the given. We have a contribution because we have seeings as that are different from just seeings, right? And but things themselves have a certain consistency that enables or not things to be done to them, conceptually or otherwise. So in a sense, I think this is a way to make plausible the idea of an objective phenomenology that Badiou is putting forward. For instance, an analytic audience or something like that, because we are also discussing about these differences. So I think this is relevant in the sense of convincing an analytic-oriented audience, but also in the sense of convincing a normal person. So I think it is a way of making plausible the idea of an objective phenomenology, the idea of constraints, the idea that yes, we have up to a point a degree of freedom to conceptualize things, but we can't really do whatever with them. They propose themselves some limits to what can be done. So this also connects with the Hegelian account on measure, in a sense of, you know, this metonymic account of, you know, things you can say things about things, but you can't say anything about anything, right? Because there are limits to what can be said truthfully or veridically about anything whatsoever. So this means there is a constraint that comes from the thing, from the consistency of the thing that appears. So I think it's an interesting way also to frame this issue of the objective phenomenology that I think I find convincing. At least it's convincing for myself. So maybe other people find convincing as well.
The thing is also, kind of nobody developed this, but it wouldn't be very hard, especially with the material that you have at the later part of the book, where you get to the problem of, let's say, how something translates into another world, or how do you code the differences in appearance of a world into another, to have a theory of where constraints, where you have a theory that's homogeneous, formally homogeneous in the way it talks about stabilities in a world and stabilities in cognition. So the world of a certain cognate agent can code aspects of a different world that's independent of it. It has its own constraints, and it can do so with a partial loss of information in one sense and on the other. So it's definitely something that is compatible, I think, with all of this. I just feel like, I'm sorry, Reza, for interrupting with this whole discussion. It's just that, though I totally agree with you, I think that it's nice to find the way of narrating these passages where it's clear, or at least we're able to articulate movement without leaving any space for the supposition that somebody's doing this to the material, right? So the idea that the regions that cohere a certain part of appearance themselves are part of appearance, right? So I see a wall and I say, man, this wall here, it's like this happens a lot. Like you're a teenager with your friends, you're like in that vibe that you are all rebels and so on. Suddenly your mom appears and says, it's time to go home, you know? Like your world crumbles. But it's not that you're leaving your world, you're just like, the fact that you're a stupid teenager synthesizes the two things together. Your mom appearing and you with your friends with your punk rock t-shirts. The fact that the point that he's making is that larger region that stabilized the envelope between these two appearances, your friends and your mom, that also appears. It's a necessary consequence of the envelope, right? Like, let's say you have absolute.
The question is that whether they belong to the same world.
They do, absolutely do.
No, I agree with you, but the question is, how do they do? Like, what are the? How can we make sense in our transcendental logic? How can we make sense of the fact that they do?
Sure, but you see, you could have two arguments, and then that's why the empirist thing. I think empirism is a nice word to talk about how Badiou deals with subjective Platonic stuff, ideas. He's an empirist about ideas, but he's very distrustful of experience. So you could say, well, there is no such thing as the scene my mom interrupted me and my friends. That's like you in your head space or whatever. There is your friends and your mom because they have like stability as living beings or whatever. But his point is that this region, which we could call a scene, right? Which has a totally different meaning and everything different, and it needs to be interpreted. Like you will, for example, justify to yourself, like, oh man, my mom, you know, she doesn't understand anything. But why are you referring to that scene? Like, why did it become the referent of your statement? Because it exists in that world. So it's not intuitive at all, the fact that these slices of appearance exist as much as its constituents, right? Sorry for giving the
thing that might be problematic about it is the examples, I think, because you know what's his example, the summer, the wall in the summer with the whatever the herb, and then you have a motorcycle. The fact that motorcycle is so aberrant in this world, it is very easy to assume it is because of our subjective, propensities. Like, oh, a noisy motorcycle does not belong in the world of a peaceful summer landscape, something like that. So the example is kind of misleading in a sense, I think, because it lends itself to this interpretation that it is a kind of a subjective experience that has some kind of expectations that get rattled by an intrusion of some sort. In order to escape this kind of this kind of understanding, I think you have to really see experience as the experience of the what we are talking about. Experience, the subjective experience is the experience of the experience, in a sense. There is a level at which, you know, the motorcycle we perceive as noisy and not belonging to, psychologically, we perceive this as psychologically not belonging to the world of the summer landscape. There's a reason for that. And the reason is not just our expectations. It's because there is a consistency in something like a motorcycle noise, and there's a consistency in a summer landscape. Of course, there is all culturally connotated, how do you say that? Culturally connotated connections there. But the fact that there is, you know, a difference in decibel level between the noise of the motorcycle does not belong to our psychology. So there is a condition of possibility to subjective phenomenology that is supposed to be given by objective phenomenology. So this is what we were talking in the beginning of the session. We talked about the subjective phenomenology as being more ontological than subjective phenomenology, in a sense, without being ontology. So something like that, I'd say. I just want to add, because I'm sure you are familiar with David Lynch's film Blue Velvet. I think it's the beginning of the film is a perfect example of, you know, the envelope, because there you get something very, very similar to Badiou's example, like somebody's, you know, doing chores in their house, and there's summer, like a summer landscape, a suburban house, and, you know, green herb, or green grass. All that, and suddenly you have a severed ear, and the severed ear is used as an entrance to a different world. Exactly. So there is something that is kind of apparent there, something that does not quite belong, or belong, but not to our not within our subjective phenomenology or our expectation of something like that. And it is there. It is in the same world, but it has a slightly disconnected sense that makes it possible to use it narratively as the opening into another world, right? So I think David Lynch is a filmmaker that has uses this a lot. And this is a conversation I have with Gabriel. I think David Lynch is almost the Logics of Worlds can be the handbook for coming up with Lynchian screenplays, I'd say. But anyway, this is just a digression.
How interesting.
Yeah, I think that there's actually a generalization of this. You know that there's this guy called Peli Gritzer who studies this crazy field of mathematically informed aesthetic theory. And he uses models from neural networks and things like this to try to understand what a modernist work of art does. And
you mean Peli Gritzer?
Peli Gritzer, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I pronounced correctly, but I love his work, and I think that I find it absolutely compatible with the things we're talking about. But I think that it goes very nicely to show this, like, there is let's say, we can extract from Badiou's example a sort of objective impetus, motivation for the poetic kind of rhetoric, because the moment that he says the wall and then the motorcycle, every time you want to go to the sort of synthetic region as a reference to maintain cohesion of the world, the harder the differences, the more absolutely distinct things are, the harder it is to find a region to which both of them belong, right? And it's really nice because his work is about this. He says, look, it's interesting because there's something about modernism, which is a sort of theory of how to learn about a vibe, about a certain way of cohering the world out of a series of objects. So you're presented, for example, with a bunch of statements from an author, and because they don't follow a sort of already established form of coherence, they have a style, right? They tend they require you to synthesize them, to learn how to synthesize them, right? And he makes this parallel between the machine learning with a data set, and you learn how to produce something new, which sees the world, sees new material from that same perspective. It takes this example, but to go through this basic idea that the process of synthesizing appearances in a certain sense, the more distinct they are, the more, let's say, the envelope is pushed towards, let's say, giving you the vibe of a certain thing, right? If you see a series of paintings, it kind of teaches you about a way of enveloping stuff, right? So there's a nice, I think there's a nice appearance of this in Logics of Worlds, because Badiou, he's saying that, let's say, regional stability, which is how he calls the problem of the envelope, right? It's part of the world. And a lot of modernist theory of art is about the idea that the vibe is objective. The vibe is not a subjective phenomenon. It's an objective aesthetic category. There's something to this, right? The idea that I think the vibe perhaps is a bit too specific a category to talk about what it means to pay attention to the objective existence of a region, of a scene, of a cohering region of the world. But I think there's a lot of connections between these things. It's very, very interesting work.
Yeah, just a concrete example would be to combine this with what was said earlier. We can call something Lynchian or Kafka.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, and that can be applied to a lot of things, not just the works of Kafka or the works of Lynch. We can say something is Lynchian that was never anticipated by Lynch himself. And that's an envelope, right?
Exactly, and that has a lot to do with section 8, with the conjunction between the being there and the region, right? Once you have a region of envelope, you can also ask the question about how other things relate to that region. It also appears, and it's also subjected to all the logics of appearance, right? I mean, I'm going to this point just because to show how broad, like how much more fits into our theory of appearance once we don't go the subjective route to explain synthesis, right? The moment that these partial synthesis, partial envelopes, regional slices or scenes of a world are included in the world as things you can refer to, you get kind of a theory of appearance that includes that sort of crazy phenomena like Telly's study, right? And more clear-cut analysis of how things appear to you or whatever.
Go on.
Sure.
Section 9, dependence, the measure of the link between two beings in a world. We have seen Badiou's insistence on transcendental logic to provide a complete logic for phenomenology. He emphasizes this right off the gate here. In the introduction to this book, we announced that the system of operations comprising the minimum, the conjunction, and the envelope was phenomenologically complete. This principle of completeness comes down to the supposition that every logical relation within appearing, that is every mode of consistency of being there, can be derived from the three fundamental operations. The focus of this section is the logical implication that is of such importance in objective phenomenology from Aristotle to Kant, and all the following forms: if A then B, if C then not B. When we say dependence of B with regards to A, we mean B depends on A. For example, a house depends on its walls. The appearance of a house a fortiori implies the appearance of its walls. Dependence is a logical relationship that is built based on the earlier, more primitive operators of relationship, conjoin, and envelope. How do we define dependence based on these primitives? We first say dependence is a common part of an envelope of appearance with A and with B. So if B depends on A, dependence is the envelope of appearances whose common parts with A has less intensity than the elements or appearances of the envelope common parts with B. This is an uncommon definition. To make sense of it, we can think in this way, use example of the house. House, in this example, appearance B as a whole appears. The roof, the wall, the bricks, etc., envelope of appearances. Also appear, and their common parts with the house are not nil. They also have common parts with the ivy, in this example, appearance A, but their common parts with the ivy are less intense than with the house. This makes the house dependent on the IV. B depends on A. So at the end, we have an envelope of appearances, wall, roof, bricks, etc., whose common parts with the house are more intense than their common parts with the IV. The latter point is important because at the end, we want to establish common parts of everything that go into the appearance of the house with the IV. That is, the members of the envelope are parts of the house, not the IV. They are intercalary with the IV and conjoint with the house, unlike parts of the IV, such as branches, leaves, and roots. Is the word dependence pertinent here? Definitely. For if a being B strongly depends on A, which is to say that the transcendental measure of dependence is high, it is because it is possible to conjoin almost the entire world to A, whilst nevertheless remaining beneath the value of appearance of B. In brief, if something quite general holds for A, then it holds a fortiori for B, since B is considerably more enveloping than A. Thus, what holds in terms of global appearing for the IV, one can see it from afar. It is bathed in the evening rays, etc. Necessarily holds for the house, whose dependence with regard to the IV is very high, maximal in effect. Dependence signifies that the predicative or descriptive situation of A holds almost entirely for B, once the transcendental value of dependence is high. I think that was straightforward.
Sorry?
That was good. That was straightforward.
Yeah, but I do think that it's nice to see, I mean, we do return to this later on with the whole chapter on transcendental, greater logic and formal logic, but it's interesting because the notion of dependence, it has that very kind of set, or it has that kind of parts and wholes kind of overtones to it, right? And it's clear that he's talking about, and he will go into this in more detail later on, but this idea of dependence needs to kind of give rise to the idea of implication, right? And predication and so on. And it's interesting because I think that a nice place to look for a comparison here in the tradition of philosophy is with Bull, and with this idea that you can, I mean, while Frege was busy modeling natural numbers on not logic implication, Bull was modeling logic on kind of basic intuitive sets, right? That idea that you can translate if A then B and if B then C, thus A leads to C. You can translate this into that sort of three sets where the set A is included in the set B is included in the set C, therefore A is included in C, right? That's actually you modeling logical implication on a sort of spatial property, right? But it's restricted. I mean, it's a similar move between logic and a sort of topological approach, but it's a restricted topological approach because you only accept either one thing is included or it's outside. Either one thing is smaller or it's bigger than, right? That's what you get there. I forgot the name of Bull's classic book on mathematical logic, but you get this interaction. This is actually a subcase of what Badiou is showing, right? His notion of dependence is, because it is reliant on this idea of partial ordering, which is much broader. It can accommodate, let's say, total inclusion, partial inclusion, certain degree of inclusion of one appearance on the evaluation of another. The way that this spatial composition, let's say, of this localization, it translates into implication will be much richer than the one that Boole proposes. And well, he will then define a Boolean world where these are restricted back to just belonging in the way that either A belongs to B and B belongs to C, and therefore A belongs to C. That will be a classical world, right? So, but the connection is very profound, and it's already here, because the idea of dependence is already a sort of, it has one step on a theory of implication, logical implication, and one step on a theory of localization, very clearly, right?
And it seems the possibility of partial ordering defeats the classical concept of negation. You can't have a classical concept of negation if you have partial ordering.
Yeah, you know, it's
right.
It regionalizes classical negation. It will be a case. It's not necessary. But it just to show, I mean, I'm trying to exercise this for myself also when we discuss this, because it's so important throughout the book, the fact that you can shift these descriptive versions of it, right? From logical analysis to a kind of topological discussion, the ordering point of view, all of them, they are equivalent in a certain sense. I forget where it is. I think it's at the end of book.
I think if I'm not mistaken, he says ontology is a classical world, right?
Yes,
because he's using reduction in order to prove that the whole is not. So you have to have classical negation in order for that to function.
Yeah. So ontology, classical negation. Ontology is based on the classical logic.
Yeah. But I just wanted to show that we can deduce this out of just this definition of dependence. It's a very powerful thing. I mean, it's very simple, it's very straight to the point, right? It follows from everything we saw before, but at the same time, it's starting to give a very, very robust kind of frame to talk about logic in a space, right? We started today with this ridiculous idea of locality, relative identity, and operational closure. We went through we saw how he goes from this to those three operators: minimality, envelope, and conjunction. And then I don't think it's for nothing that he begins part 9 by kind of summarizing or saying, look, in the introduction of the book, I said I would do this and that, and this is phenomenologically complete. Because he's actually saying a lot of shit when he says that you can define dependence in this way, and that this is, let's say, the basis for this what is it? Okay, you guys are having a discussion. I just think that there is a very strong point here. I'm just got lost in the chat window. Very strong point on the start kind of coming to the fore, a more clear kind of inner structure of the reference, right? This what we call the localization of disappearance with regards to one another. It's starting to become clear how this will correlate to the sort of implicative structure that goes along with it, right? Because appearances are organized in this way via these three minimal operators, we already start seeing why statements in the sense of the house is up because it has walls is correct. It will be true in that world, right? Why this implication holds. So it's a very big jump done very succinctly, I think.
I agree, JP. I am not fond of his examples.
Yeah, great. Let's go on to wrap it up. We are near the end of the Transcendental, so I'm excited about finishing this.
So number 10, the reverse of an apparent in the world. We saw dependence operator as a derived operator. If A is dependent on B, this dependence is in the transcendental logic is signified by an envelope of appearances, each of which has a common part with A and with B, but their common parts with A are all of higher intensity than they do with B. In this section now, using the operator of minimum identity, conjoin an envelope, but U is trying to derive the operator of negation, quote, we will show that given the degree of appearance of a being, we can define the reverse of this degree and therefore the support for logical negation or negation in appearing as a simple consequence of our three fundamental operations. We define an external degree of appearance that is the result of the operation of minimum or identity, operator A or the first transcendental operation in the list we derived earlier. To another degree of appearance, a degree whose conjunction with the given degree is equal to nil. Also, we define an external region as the region that envelopes those appearances whose conjunction with the given appearance is nil. The envelope of appearances whose intensity is slightly higher than the intensity of each appearance and whose appearances each has a conjunction with a given appearance outside the envelope is nil, we call the negation of the given appearance. It's remarkable that what will serve to sustain negation in the order of appearing is the first consequence of the transcendental operation and by no means an initial given. Negation is the extended and positive form of existence of the reverse of a being is a result. We can say that as soon as we are dealing with the being of the being, of being there, that is with the being of appearing as bound to the logic of a world, it follows that the reverse of a being exists in the sense that there exists a degree of appearance contrary to its own. Clearly, Badiou calls this envelope the reverse and not the negation. He makes two observations. First, the definition of reverse is a positive definition. It refers to an envelope of appearances in the world, which because it is an envelope, it is governed by the regional stability of the world. Second, unlike the formal logic that negation is a primitive operation, reverse in the transcendental logic is a derived operation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he writes, he knows that he's annoying a lot of people when he writes this. Like all Hegelians who loved him so much, at this point, they're all, I mean, I remember the first time I read this, I was like, this is absurd. Of course.
What the hell is he doing?
Exactly. How can he claim to be an heir of Hegel and say this? And it goes all the way back to that argument with domains, situations, and references coming before, right? But it's, where is the statement here I wanted to mention? But it's funny because at the same time that he removes the grounds from our ontological kind of favorite, right? Negativity as the sort of ontological primitive, he clarifies the link between negation and synthesis or universality, which is something so dear to Hegelians and so hard to explain, right? Because now you see that as a reverse, the definition of negation is intrinsic to the problem of the envelope, right? To negate something is to consider the envelope of what is not it, right?
Exactly.
So in that sense, negation and synthesis, they are composite terms. Yeah, it's funny because he seems on one hand to be demoting negation, but he's actually making more strict the connection between totality and negation. He's situating that connection.
Actually, he makes this comment elsewhere. I think in positive dialectic, there is a little text. I don't know.
Affirmative dialectic.
Affirmative dialectic. He makes a comment that you need a new dialectic which is positively grounded. He's basically coming back to that statement. He made that way before logic of words.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean he's that sort of nightmare of a certain Deleuzean critique, which is, you know, let's overcome Hegel by turning to an affirmative kind of perspective, and then you get the whole of Hegel back within the affirmative perspective. I find that, let's say, the ultimate vengeance of Hegelianism, that you can get most of the properties of a Hegelian philosophy within a philosophy that accepts the challenge of, okay, let's start with affirmation, everything is thinkable, negation is secondary, and things like this. You still get the same properties on the other side, like most of what is crucial, you know?
Actually, I think his being an event is also in the same vein. I mean,
I totally agree. Yeah.
His main point is to emphasize that any situation of being has an excess as opposed to a lack.
Mm-hmm.
So number 11, there exists a minimal degree of appearance in a world. Having a given minimum in every word, and the definition of reverse or negation, we say maximum is the negation of minimum. The existence of a maximum deduced here as the reverse of minimum is a worldly principle of stability. Appearing is never endlessly amendable. There is no infinite ascension towards the light of being there. The maximum of appearance distributes onto the beings indexed to it the calm and equitable certainty of their worldliness. You can say that he's reaching the end. His language is getting poetic.
You can.
This is also because there is no universe, only worlds. In each and every world, the immanent existence of the maximal value for the transcendental degrees signals that this world is never the world. A word's power of localization is determinate. If a multiple appears in the word, there is an absolute degree of disappearance. This degree marks the being of being there for a world. And number 12, what is the reverse of the maximal degree of appearance? In this obscure and not so limpid text, Badiou attempts to prove that the reverse of maximum is minimum. But isn't minimum a given and maximum just the reverse of that? In section 11, here are some important passages. So it is very intriguing that he's following his own, that reverse of a reverse is not necessarily equal to the identity. But in this case, it is. So the reverse of minimum is maximum, but not necessarily the reverse of maximum is minimum. We have to show that. The conjunction between the maximum, the existence of which we have just established, and any transcendental degree is equal to the latter. The reverse of the maximum is the minimum, is simply a consequence of this remark. The last sentence does not make much sense to me, and I'm bringing this so we can discuss it. The degree of maximal appearance measures appearance as such, namely the entire world, to the extent that it brings forth a measure of appearing. We can say that the maximum degree fixes there of being there in its fixed certainty. The conjunction between a singular intensity of appearance and the maximal intensity does nothing but return the initial intensity. The equation, the conjunction of the maximum and of a degree is equal to that degree, is therefore phenomenologically limpid.
Yeah, because I mean, now that we got to the end of this, I'm not sure if you guys would agree with this, but I feel like, let me just share my screen here 1 second, since we finished this. Let me attempt. It's like we did this, like section 1, sections 1, let's put it like this. The idea of local consistency, the idea of relative difference, and the idea of operational closure. They're all part of us, like, they're given on parts 1, 2, and 3, right? Oh shit, what's going on? Why am I so stupid? They're given at first, these 3 concepts. This is presented in part 1. This is presented on part 2. This is introduced on part 3. Then part 4 is kind of, he calls all of this objective, or he calls all of this transcendental. Then on, which is part 4. Then he goes to 3, he goes to this and says, we have now, from this we have minimum, reverse, not conjunction, and envelope. So these 3 concepts, why isn't this part 5, 6, and 7. Then again, we have part 8, which was about what?
Sorry, I was on mute. Before the first section, you want to put in existence of the whole.
Yeah, but in existence, that's where the local consistency is argued.
I know, but local consistency is all of this is derived from inconsistency of the whole.
Okay, let's put it here. Right, and I'm putting transcendental here as a sort of, it's a passage chapter, right? Then we have 5, 6, and 7. Then 8 is actually a it's an operation that uses, it's the first operation that uses this tree, right? So we have conjunction between being there and appearance, dependence. Actually, this thing here is a condition. Chapter 8 again is a condition for the later ones. It's not, let's say, so classically a development as the idea of dependence, reverse, maximal, which are again big concepts, but they are all derived from this previous development, right? But from the composition of the tree, so it's not simply linear, which is 9, 10, and 11. And then again on 12, which is the one we just read, he puts an additional clause, which is reverse of maximal doesn't equal minimum. Which again is something that is developed from what came before, right? But I think that this helps to see that there are, let's say, kind of different registers of that this chapter produced, right? In terms of this sort of thing here, then this, and then this, right? These 3 things here are derived from this above. And these 3 things here are derived from this above, right? It's not simply linear. 5 and then 6. There's a certain kind of strata. And I think it's important just to understand this, because making sure that these ideas, that this passage here from inconsistency to this, that this is clear, and that how these three things are connected, what these three concepts mean, and how they are connected in these things here, I think is the things we need to make sure that we understand before we move forward, you know. Sorry to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just want to correct one thing. In 12, the reverse of the maximal is the minimum, right?
Is that what it says?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what
the
he
last
says.
For all cases?
Yeah.
For all cases, it is.
Ah, okay, sorry. Why is this not? For some reason, I'm too stupid to correct my own. Yeah, which gives us a closure, right? In fact,
Yeah.
So it's interesting because this helps here to understand it, because in the end of the day, this thing here connects to this thing here, right? I mean, actually, I should have done this to make it clear. I think it's actually very helpful if you look at it in this way, because what you get here is, let's say, the abstract. By section 4, we got an abstract idea of this local totality we call a world, right? By section 8, we get an idea of a regional stability, of, let's say, there is such a thing as a region of a world. Let's say, or in other words, scenes exist, or vibes exist, or these regions that have some coherence, synthetic coherence, they exist, right? They're part of a world. And then we have here this, at the end, which I think it's a bit hermetic, I agree with Reza, this idea that, well, what we call a maximum in a world is kind of like the appearance of its appearance, right?
He alludes to that in the next section.
Sorry?
Yeah, he alludes to that when he compares this with the law, appearance as a law, or law of appearing in Hegel.
Yeah, but I mean, in section 12, doesn't he say, doesn't he say, I think you even quoted this, that the maximum degrees fixes the there of being there.
Yeah.
Right? It gives you, let's say, the placing, the whole as a parent placing. So you see, all of these three, all chapter 4, chapter 8, and chapter 12, they're all about, let's say, giving concreteness to what's more total, right?
Yeah, he says the degree of maximal appearance measures appearance as such.
Yes, yeah, that's what I want. So here's world, in fact.
Namely, the entire world, to the extent that it brings forth a measure of appearing.
But you see, like sections 4, 8, and 12, they were all about, let's say, using these local ideas. In the case of chapters 1, 2, and 3, more conceptual ideas, and in sections 5, 6, and 7, operators rather than just concepts, right? And then derived operators in section 9, 10, and 11. But chapters 4, 8, and 12, they use these operators or concepts to give you an idea of what a localized whole or a world looks like. So I think this is just a strategy to understand how to bring these concepts together, you know?
Yeah, this is good.
Because I do think it's already so hard to understand this crazy stuff that sometimes it's hard to at the same time You're not convinced that the third line is derived from the second line.
Yeah, I'm not sure, or I'm not convinced, but I like your idea. But I
No,
don't.
I mean, but is there a disagreement on the fact that the notion of dependence is just a composite of the notions of conjunction, envelope, and minimum?
No. Second line is the first line are the three. So you have inconsistency of the world, and then you conclude few things, which are basically the characteristic of the transcendental of each world.
Okay,
So,
you call this the second line, and this is
yeah,
the third.
right.
Ah, okay. I thought you meant the third and the fourth. Yeah, the passage from the world to the minimum, it's actually, which is what he focused with Hegel, right? Is there a connection between being, multiplicity of being and being there? That's I agree, it's a tricky passage. I think that's the one you're talking about, if it's truly.
Yeah. I mean, he's not doing an explicit construction. It is interesting if we do an explicit construction between the two.
Yeah, I do think it. I mean,
that,
yeah, I think there is a. By the way, I'm just using the whiteboard from Zoom. Like it's just Zoom itself. It has this function. But I mean, this is a point where Zizek complained, and that many people complain, and that he tries to anticipate with the discussion on Hegel, which is what sort of justification or what sort of passage do we need to show there is between being and being there, right? And I think the order of reasons he tries to argue, which is part of chapter 4, is chapter 4 to chapter 5, section 4 to 5, is to say, and I think it's actually, man, we argued this when we were reading the preface, and I think here is how we see this operating. We argue that he doesn't use critical tools or critique as a conceptual tool. Critique suggests that you look for the presupposition, and when you include the presupposition in the totality, you self-sunder the totality, right? It's finding presuppositions, finding the support of a claim, and showing how it contradicts the claim. That's, let's say, the Hegelian or Kantian or whatever approach. And we showed that Badiou, even with the discussion between democratic materialism and materialist dialectic, he doesn't do that. He talks about, let's say, the poverty or the expansion of spaces, right? The democratic materialism is poor in comparison with the space of materialist dialectic. One is bigger than the other, right? And I think that there is a similar argument style behind the passage from being to being there. Because what he does is to say, look, if there are multiple worlds, then there must be something and there is no totality, no whole. There must be something which is not in a world. That's the jump that he's giving. He's saying, necessarily, if there is an operational closure and a local consistency and a plurality of worlds, there must be something which is not in a world. Otherwise, there would be a whole.
Say it again.
If there is no whole, that means, and we're not within logics and worlds, we're prior to that. If there is no whole, there are multiple situations, multiple domains. For there to be multiple domains is equivalent to saying that there are things which are not in domains. There are things which are not in a certain domain.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's the basic passage to say, well, if a domain does not include everything, cannot include everything, there are things which are not presented in a domain. So a thing and its being in a domain cannot be the same. So being in a domain and being are not the same.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, the argument to pass from being to being there. And because being there, and why the first operator is the minimum. Because the first problem is that there are only worlds because things do not appear in every world, right? If everything appeared in a world, there would be no world. There would be a whole. So I think in the order of reasons we have in existence of the whole, from this we derive some things are not in given a domain, something is not in it. So there is a distinction between being and being in a domain. Those two things are not coincidental, right? So I think that's the second step. And then the third step, which is what brings him to the minimum, is therefore there are things that do not appear in a given domain. So I would say that those are the three steps that he goes very quickly in part 4 here. So I wouldn't say it's a deduction of the minimum out of the closure, but it's kind of. And much later, when he talks about logical completeness of a world, and he pretty much spells out that what he was talking about all along was the idea of operational closure, right? For a world to be have an inaccessible cardinality and to be logically closed. That's what's actually defining what he calls here operational closure, right? It will translate very similar ideas, I think.
Yeah, I have to go pretty soon, but
Yeah,
I just want one comment from exactly from what you're saying, this first red line to the second red line. One thing we should consider is that these operations will work if the transcendental only has one degree, which is the minimum, I think. So like we made the assumption that the transcendental will have multiple degrees, right? But actually these operations all work even if the only degree that exists in the transcendental is the minimum.
You mean what operations? All of them?
Like conjunction. You can do conjunction of minimum with minimum to get minimum.
Mm-hmm.
You can take the envelope of the minimum, which is the minimum.
Ah, yes.
The dependence of the minimum on the minimum is the minimum, and the reverse of the minimum is the maximum, which is actually the minimum, since it's the only degree.
Yeah.
So
actually, the interesting thing is that minimum is a degree as well as an operation. So the only degree that exists is like is the degree of minimum. All other degrees are constructible from minimum. Is that what you're saying, Dennis?
oh no. I'm saying that only with one degree, like the transcendental only needs one degree for these operations to, these operations don't suppose that we have any specific number besides the minimum
Mm-hmm.
of degrees, yeah.
Well, can't we, so yes, well, well, there is a degree that is called nil, right?
No, that's the minimum, I thought.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I'm just saying all this because exactly this movement from the circle 4, when we describe the transcendental and then we move on to this next thing, actually
Mm-hmm.
the minimum is already like enough to talk about these things, although it's useless from a practical standpoint to talk about transcendental that's only the minimum, but it's enough already to have that for all this stuff to be coherent.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be like the null transcendental. So like nothing appears in this world. It's the world where nothing appears.
Yeah, it's a world. It's coherent to talk about. Yeah. What I just want to make sure, just to clarify, Reza, I don't think it's ever a matter of deriving beings in this, like it was in being an event, showing that from the void in a certain set of operators, you derive other sets, right? Here, the multiples are given because we're not talking about the being of the multiples, we're talking about the being there of the multiples. So it's the there that we're exploring, right?
No,
I don't think it's a matter of deriving.
What I was referring to was exactly the idea of measure. So the only
yeah.
the only measure that is given because of the first line is the measure of not being there. That's
Yes.
the measure.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
any
Now
other
I see.
measure is built from that measure.
Yes, that thing I agree. And I think that's the passage from the first concept to the minimum, because he goes as far as saying this very explicitly. I just need to find it. That's yeah, I won't be able to find it.
Okay, are we meeting next week?
Yes.
And so we are not going through the Hegel section. We are jumping to the formal presentation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what Caron wants to do. I would just suggest that, I mean, I don't think it's necessary. Like, if he wants to do it any other way, I wouldn't disagree or wouldn't be contrary to moving in a different speed, you know, if you prefer. But I'm all up for whatever you guys prefer.
Yeah, I'm actually scheduled for next week. I'm preparing something, but anyway, if Reza wants to read the Hegel session, we can share the section and I complete my presentation
Well,
the following week.
not necessarily that I want to read it, but I think it's an important didactical section for us to understand.
Yeah,
Perhaps we could reserve a part of the meeting to talk about that section rather than read through it.
Yeah. Instead of presenting something, we just take it that everybody read that part and we can discuss it while I present other things. And something like that.
I agree with that. So have a free discussion and then your formal presentation.
Yeah, something like that. Fine.
Great, guys. I think we did a lot of work today.
Yeah, I'm tired.
No, but it was good. It was good. I understand this stuff better now, and I see the value of American Pie as an example to teenage embarrassment as a phenomenological problem.
Yeah, from David Lynch to American Pie. Badiou's life.
A Badiouian interpretation of American Pie.
The envelope between American Pie and David Lynch's Blue Velvet.
Yes, and I really suggest if anyone is interested. I mean, I just a little more propaganda. Nobody has done this. I imagine that Peli Gritzer himself probably has a lot of prejudices against Badiou, but I find it amazing the similarities and how useful one thing could be to read the other. And he definitely provides more Badiouian examples than Badiou at this point. I mean, we totally glozed over the fact that Badiou gives a very kind of sketchy argument with the whole women in the Ducasse opera and Ava Gardner. It's horrible, man.
That's I understand why Reza use it. I think, yeah, Reza, that's right. That's the right decision because I don't even understand the example properly. I was what?
Yeah.
Well, give the guy some credit, man. He's like 80 years old. That's he brings examples from the world that he's passionate about.
Yes.
Ava Gardner.
There's a credit to the fact that he just dug up an obscure opera by Paul Dukas to talk about it. I think this is very, very noble of his, but you know.
Yeah, I think we should give ourselves the task of finding better examples or examples that are from our worlds a bit, and it's actually very useful to. I think the David Lynch idea is very good, and I think we should try to kind of substitute his examples for other examples as we go along. It's a good exercise.
I actually think that the technique of David Lynch storytelling is related to that envelope business. Really, I do think this is a strong thesis of mine now. That you understand David Lynch's technique of storytelling. Storytelling, I mean the story, the way things get weird, there's a specific way things get weird in his movies, and it's related to that envelope thing. It's not like, you know, Andalu by Luis Buñuel is all, you know. It's a world that is, the world is weird. In David Lynch, no, you have this encounter between different worlds with different consistencies, and they are kind of separate, and there is encounter.
Yeah, but Carol, I think we could really use this to discuss, because we had this discussion about what it takes for things to be different worlds, right? And I think that envelopes is the opposite of separate worlds. Is the proof that incommensurability can happen in a world. So there are no two worlds. And I do think that this is actually a good example, because Lynch is weird, and I think Zizek analyzes him as being uncanny precisely because the weirdness is a part of the world. The weirdness is not the intrusion of a different world. It's not like the dream world, right? You get this, for example, this whole idea of splitting the world in two.
I'm not sure. I don't think it is there from the beginning. I think there is a certain consistency, and there's a certain rupture that reveals itself to be part of the world. But, you know, in the narrative, the fact that that thing is in the envelope, of course, it is part of the world. It provides a gateway to another envelope, to another world.
Sure, but don't use world to, but just don't use world to the other thing, because you can have other things in the same world. Like otherwise, you suggest. I mean, I think and Edge just mentioned here is Twin Peaks. Like the world is twin, right? The two things are in one thing. Like
that's the whole point. That's the
whole point, exactly. Like the tension comes from what sort of static operation is needed to keep the world together when you have, you know, Isabelle, I forgot her name, the actress in Blue Velvet, in her room and his house with his family in the same world.
I think Asia wants to say something, but he's on.
I'm so invested in this Twin Peaks thing. Somebody must write something up.
We should let's start listing this kind of sidetrack quests. There's the analytic debate. We could do a meeting only on Twin Peaks. I'd love to separate like some bits for us to discuss, specific bits, you know. That could work. But Carol, you saw my point, right, regarding calling that division, the division of two worlds, because that's why the aesthetic is so complicated of making it, like take Mulholland Drive, right? You get that division between two spaces, but the weird thing is how do you connect them? They're never totally apart.
Yeah.
That's why Zizek's obsessed with him.
Usually we might think of it as some kind of leak. It's like the other space is leaking into
yes, I think the other space is leaking is a David Lynch short film waiting to be made. Right?
Yeah.
The other space is leaking. Somebody should do something with that.
Yeah, maybe my presentation will use Lynchian examples. I'll try.
Who is making a presentation on Twin Peaks?
I think I'm starting to think that the guy behind the mic, exactly. Yeah, talk about the Mexican. Yeah. I love that scene is.
I was thinking of this example. Yes, that guy is. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the greatest example ever.
I see that this will need to be taken more seriously then. So let's start thinking about separating a Lynchian, logic of Lynchian worlds session then.
Yeah, like applied, but you.
Yeah.
Sounds good, guys. I gotta go
guys. See you guys next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.